It's time to rewild for nature recovery. We're in the midst of a biodiversity crisis and a climate emergency, but it's not all bad news. We're in a very privileged position as landowners and land managers to make a difference and use our sites for nature recovery. At Ground Control, we're working with our clients across the UK. These include Tesco's, Sainsbury's, the NHS, Travelodge and Severn Trent Water to take a nature positive approach to land management. By working together, we're looking to boost biodiversity and achieve environmental goals. So what can you do for nature? Today we're down at Little Cowbridge Wood, which is part of our 35-acre Green Gains site in Essex. We've planted over 22,000 trees as part of the woodland creation, and we changed the management of the existing hedgerows and grasslands to focus on nature recovery. On this tour, we'll share a breadth of rewilding techniques that include woodland, meadow and habitat creation. You'll take away the know-how to enhance your land for nature. Together, we'll turn biodiversity ambition into action. So we're down in Little Cowbridge Wood. It's our woodland creation project, the first large-scale nature recovery project that we did as a business. We've basically created 9.2 hectares of new native broadleaf woodland from 2 underused areas of grasslands. We've worked in conjunction with the Forestry Commission to gain grant funding for the capital works and a number of other stakeholders such as the Environment Agency to develop our plans to make the most of this woodlands within this specific situation. We've used a variety of native trees and shrubs. We've got 16 different tree species that include oak, hornbeam, willow, alder, so a really good range. It's really important to get as much variety in the tree species as we can because of the challenges of climate change, potential future pests and diseases coming in. Alongside those trees, we've got 10 native species of hedgerow and woodland edge shrubs. We've developed this site because it was the land that we had available, but it can be scalable both up and down in terms of scope. We can create woodlands can be the size of a tennis court to really extensive woodland where the land allows. These nature recovery techniques can be applied to a whole range of sites, and we can tailor-make those to the land that is available. In terms of nature recovery, we see this new woodland playing a really important role in this location, and we're looking at how that connects through with the hedgerow network. We're developing the hedgerows around the site, and they will be the links to the other areas of woodland in the area. The site here, we're looking at the boundary which has had an existing agricultural hedgerow to it. It's got a footpath as well, so we've got public access, and what we've done is really look at how we can maximise this feature for nature. So we've let the hedgerow grow out, we're not cutting it back as frequently. We need to maintain the access for the footpath, but we can let the feature expand naturally, and we've got natural regeneration, we've got an increase in height. So this is something that you could look to do on your own site. Assess your sites to see where operationally you could let hedgerows grow a bit taller, a bit wider. You could look to introduce tree planting into those hedgerows, and this will create more of a nature corridor that will attract a much wider range of insects, birds and other mammals, so really multiple benefits by just changing your management regime on site. Utilising your hedgerows can happen on a wide range of scales. You don't need miles and miles of hedgerow to make an impact. Hedgerow is a really useful connector, so one side of your site to the other and connecting out into the wider landscape. This is the second area of woodland creation. It's a wet woodland, and we've designed the tree species around that. So we've got more willow, alder, downy birch, which gives a totally different character to this area of the site. And most importantly, we've got a significant area of open space, which is really important to give that diversity of habitats within a given area. So this has allowed us to manage the grassland in a totally different way. It's gone from being grazed by sheep to a very low level to being pretty much left to develop over the seasons. In turn, by changing the management of the grassland, we'll be attracting a wider range of insects, which will then attract a wider range of birds and other animals that feed on those. Also, it allows an open area for bats to forage and potentially for predators like barn owls to hunt on the small mammals that will be attracted to this type of habitat. If you've got grassland on your own site, the first step would be to look at changing the management regime. So where you've got amenity grass, you might be cutting it 6 to 12 times a year under a standard maintenance arrangement. So reducing that right down to potentially cut and collect only once a year at the end of August will be the first step to transforming that grassland for nature. The second opportunity would be to increase the species diversity by wildflower plug planting or potentially overseeding areas with wildflower seed, and that just increases the diversity of plants that you've got with that area, and that will bring those benefits to biodiversity along with them. We're very lucky at Little Cowbridge to have a watercourse running through the middle of the new woodland creation site. So that gives us a real opportunity to develop another type of habitat within the same area. But with that opportunity comes responsibility. So we need to make sure we're protecting that feature as well as enhance it. So if you've got a river or a watercourse on your site, the first thing we'd look to do is carry out that initial baseline evaluation. We'd come in with our ecologists to do a habitat survey, but also a species survey to see what you've got present on site at the moment. And then from that we can develop our designs to reflect and enhance those species and also bring in new species as well that aren't being currently catered for by the design. We want to build up tree planting but in smaller pockets, not shading out the watercourse too much, getting that balance between sunlight and shade on the water to make the most of that existing habitat. We're very lucky at Little Cowbridge to have some amazing specimen trees around the site, like this majestic oak that we're under now. And it's about assessing those, A, from a health and safety perspective, but also from a nature perspective to see what features are there that could attract nesting birds and bats. We've assessed this tree as a moderate potential for bats. It has existing natural features within it, but we could also enhance those potentially with bat boxes or bird boxes for the bird population. Scrub is a very important habitat because it's actually very scarce around the UK. Through management it has been lost, and it's really biodiverse and a rich habitat. Here we've tried to let that develop by letting blocks of hawthorn, blackthorn spread, allowed bramble to develop, so really encouraged that element of the landscape. It's viewed importantly by the DEFRA metric, so it scores very highly as a habitat type. If you've been inspired to rewild your land and take part in nature recovery for the UK, then start your biodiversity conversation with us. Head to ground-control.co.uk to discover more.
If I could get everybody to take a seat, please. So first of all, a very warm welcome to all of our guests, and good morning. What a beautiful day for Green Gains Live 2. It's like Christmas for me and my dogs. Thank you for coming. This is the second Green Gains Festival, and I'd like to welcome all of the government agencies and leaders from local, regional, and national level government agencies. So many of our customers are here, private landowners, the charities like the Wildlife Trust, Wildflower Trust, Bumblebee Trust, organizations, Kew Gardens, Cambridge University, and so importantly, our colleagues from Ground Control. There are a huge team of like-minded individuals that work at Ground Control that care deeply about the environment, about biodiversity, and about nature. And we have wonderful biologists, ecologists, biodiversity specialists, and environmental sustainability specialists here to lead you on tours later on. So very warm welcome. Thank you so much for coming. And we are streaming live on LinkedIn and YouTube. So for our virtual audience, thank you so much for tuning in this morning, and we'll be taking questions from you throughout the first part of the morning, and then we'll have Q&A for those lab participants and those online at the very end of today's sessions before the tours commence. Okay? I was asked to have everybody raise their hands from different organizations. So if you're from one of the government agencies, could you please just throw up your hand? From Highways Agency? The water companies, housing associations, retail, property managers. So what's real, charitable trust, Wildlife Trust, Wildflower, Bumblebee. So what I love to think about is cross-pollination. So if you can think about folks you would like to learn from here, the name tags are supposed to be big font so everybody can see folks they might be able to connect with as we go through the day. It'd be wonderful that you can talk to like-minded individuals in your sector, or actually completely other sectors, about what they're doing. Virtually, we have DP World, Kier, Welsh Water, and BAM Nuttall joining us online. So what are we going to talk about most importantly today is how do we collectively, we're all here because we care about biodiversity, what can we do, learn, and talk about to really advance networks for nature conservation? Everyone here has come together for exactly that reason. There's been lots of learnings in the past 12 months since our last Green Gains Lab, but there's also been some things in the backdrop that have not gone exactly to plan. So the COP15 was delayed. The summit to talk specifically about this was delayed due to COVID and has been rescheduled. The change in government is left us with a very unpredictable canvas moving forward, and how that might affect all the progress that was being made. More than ever, it's up to businesses and charities coming out of the European Union with that long-term vision on sustainability and legislation that protected nature without short-term political objectives. And now changes, we see it every day in priorities around COVID, our wars, our economic collapse, whatever it is, how can businesses and charities keep things going for a longer term view for nature and ecology? And so that is the challenge, and we're going to talk about today. We're going to showcase some wonderful things that we've done here. So thank you for joining us in Billericay, Essex. We have 23,000 native hardwoods, the big wildflower meadows. There's areas of rewilding, orchards, pollinator planting, beehives. There's all sorts of things that we've done here on a small scale on 35 acres. And then we're going to talk about wildfell. My colleague Chris Bawtry will talk about the progress we've made now on design, but especially coupling and partnering with the Forestry Commission, with Woodland Trust, with the Wildlife Trust, to really think about what we can do there on a 300-acre canvas. And that Wildfell Center is really to help our customers think about what they can do. We've made the investment commercially, and how can we all learn from that? Questions and answers will be at the end, and we're going to run through, first and foremost, our wonderful keynote speaker, Tony Juniper. I met Tony on an airplane, now it's close to 18 years ago when I first came into ground control. He unknowingly has probably influenced certainly my thinking, and as a result, the way we think about sustainability and ground control for all these years. It's been a very informal, unpaid role, but a tremendous godsend for what we're doing for nature. He's our keynote speaker. For those of you that are not familiar with Tony, he's the chair of Natural England. He has been an executive director of almost all the big wildlife organizations for the past 35 years. So World Wildlife Fund, Friends of the Earth. He advises private businesses. He was a fellow at Cambridge University. He's an advisor to the Prince of Wales. He's written so many different books and was described as the country's leading eco-warrior. I always call people a force of nature, but Tony is a force for nature. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Tony to the stage, and we're going to have about 40 minutes with him. Having just taken my kids to the Rolling Stones, and we skipped all the warm-up bands, I said, listen, let's start straight with the main event, and here's Tony. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed, Kim, for that very nice introduction and warm welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and to be continuing to see the journey that ground control has been on. And I've been delighted to be a very small part of the thinking that you've been developing over these years. And I think to say that your company now is in a leadership position really understates where you've got to, because it's really incredible the work that you've been doing, including bringing people together to start thinking about what might be done about some of these questions. Because as time goes on, you know, the kind of jeopardy just goes up and up and up as we witness massive forest fires, extreme temperature events, water shortages, endless reports coming from UN agencies about how pressing the situation is, and yet we still struggle to move into the zone of decisive action. But that's really where we must be. There is no time really now for talk anymore. It's about doing. And that's what today is all about. And bringing people together to start thinking about the kinds of partnerships and common cause that can be found to go on this journey in a good way. And Kim, I think today biodiversity really is the theme, isn't it? And so focusing in on some of these questions that have been slightly lower profile when it comes to these sustainability discussions over recent years. And I think if you just kind of tune into the media, look at the political discussion, see where the speeches have been going from different leaders, it's climate, 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 carbon, carbon, carbon. And of course, this is completely correct. There is an emergency underway, and we all know about that. And COP26 in this country last year was an opportunity to really focus on the implications and what's happening and what needs to be done. But there's been another dimension to this sustainability story which has been flying slightly below the radar. It's starting to get up now as a result of COP15 this year. The biodiversity conference will hopefully see a little bit more of this. But the truth is that there's a parallel crisis seen in the decline of biodiversity, which is right there with climate change and which needs equal urgent attention, if not more urgent attention. And part of the trouble with the biodiversity piece is it's a little bit more complicated. And so carbon coming out of your exhaust pipe or by switching the light on, it's relatively easy. We're going to shut a coal-fired power station and we're going to have renewables. You can see the connections and it's easy to explain. With biodiversity, it's not so easy to explain. And part of the trouble actually comes with that word, I've decided over the years. Would you believe the BBC, I think in about 2011, did a vox pop. They went into the street and they asked members of the public, what do you think biodiversity is? And do you know what the single most popular answer was? A washing powder. Now, that's an anecdote based upon a survey of the public, but I think it's probably not wrong in the sense of how much we need to improve the communications and understanding on all of this. And this is one reason why during my work over recent years, I've kind of abolished the word biodiversity and replaced it with nature. I think more people get nature. It's actually quite a profound term, and it's got really kind of very wide kind of interpretation, which is good. It's the name of the world's most prestigious scientific journal, and it's also the study that you do in primary school with your nature table, and it's got everything in between. And I think it's the right way of looking at this, because it is about literally everything. That's what we're talking about. The fabric of our society, our economy, our civilization, it all depends upon nature. The biodiversity piece, however, is a technical term, just worth spending a second on it, because it's literally about the variety of life and at many different levels. And if you look at the specialist literature, you'll see biodiversity described as the diversity of ecosystems on our planet. The tropical rainforests, the coral reefs, the grasslands, the modified ecosystems in which we grow food, farmed landscapes, that's all biodiversity. And then that biodiversity, for ecologists like me, very often our attention is drawn to the species mix in there. The animals, the plants, the fungi, and understanding the complement of life that should be in those different ecosystems. And then we have the genetic diversity. This room's a great example. We're all the same species, Homo sapiens, but there's no two people in this room that are identical, unless there are some twins. I didn't see any yet. But we are an expression of biodiversity at that level. And so all these three levels of biodiversity are interacting in different ways. And the trouble is that it's in massive decline. And the reason it's in massive decline is because of increasing human demand. The human demand is going up and the biodiversity is going down. You all will have seen pictures of tropical rainforests being cut down. You will have seen pictures of coral reefs going into terminal decline as a result of ocean heating and acidification. And you will have seen the ever-lengthening lists of species that are disappearing from so-called red lists compiled by the scientists. And all of this is a manifestation of biodiversity loss and, crucially, ecosystem degradation. These two things are going alongside each other. And the loss of abundance is one measure. So out in the countryside here, 50 years ago, you would have seen many more birds and butterflies in terms of numbers. Some of the species have actually gone as well. But you would have seen a decline in abundance. Across the globe, we're also seeing a decline in species as represented by extinction. You know, that's the end. Once something has gone over the edge of that particular point, then it's into oblivion. It's gone for good. And the extinction rate on our planet at the moment is ramping up very rapidly. You can see the curve going like this. It's difficult to measure, unlike tons of carbon, because we haven't even documented the wildlife that shares this planet with us. Probably 9 or so million other species. We've described about 2 million. We're assuming there's 7 million more there based upon what we think we don't know. That's how precise this science is. But based upon what we do know and the ones we're monitoring, and in this country we've got better data than anywhere, we can see it going down. And so the extrapolation from the scientists on this, there's a body called the Intergovernmental Panel on the Science of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They're equivalent to the IPCC on climate change. They get less of a profile. Their name doesn't help either, actually. It's a bit like the biodiversity word. But they have documented a period of decline now that they are anticipating will lead to 1 million extinctions during the course of this century, and possibly more. Now, that level of extinction has occurred on this planet a few times in the past. The most recent one, this is the 6th mass extinction. There's 5 previous ones. If we allow this 6th one to occur, it will be the first time we've lost diversity on that scale on this planet for about 65 million years. So the last time that scale of biodiversity loss occurred was when an asteroid collided with this planet at the end of the Cretaceous era, marking the end of the dinosaurs and much else of life on Earth. So that's the level of the stakes that we are now facing. On this particular emergency, which hitherto has been flying slightly below the radar compared to the climate emergency. And so, you go into the political discussion, and we're having one right now. It's really interesting. Why should we save biodiversity? Why should we restore nature? Why should we be investing in this? Cost of living crisis, we've got economic growth, we've got to get back on track. Surely these environmental priorities, they're getting in the way of economic growth, aren't they? And therefore we must prioritise progress for the people above the protection or recovery of nature. That's how the political narrative goes. And unfortunately, there is still life in that. I thought a few years ago that the final breath of the idea that we have to sacrifice nature to achieve progress, I thought it was about to die off, but it's still there. It's weaker than it was, but the thought that we have to sacrifice the fabric of this planet's living systems in order to sustain human well-being, people still think it. But actually, the science tells us the complete opposite is correct. If we wish to have a functioning society, economy, and indeed civilization at the end of this century, or possibly even closer than that, then we have to halt and reverse the destruction of nature as a matter of urgent priority. And so there is a vast array of studies and technical reports that have been conducted into this question. And I've reviewed many of them over the years. And, you start looking at that stuff and you can paint a very vivid story as to why the most economically and socially rational strategy is to halt and reverse biodiversity loss to bring back the health of nature now. So why is that? Well, one reason is that climate emergency that has got political traction and still remains quite high on the agenda. A little bit of needling about net zero from various politicians at the moment, but they kind of get that. What they seem to have less got is that we can't do net zero unless we restore the natural world. You look out there at all that green stuff has got a very important thing in it. It's called carbon. This planet has carbon-based life forms, and the more we have carbon-based life forms thriving and accumulating carbon from the atmosphere, the less of it is in the air warming up the planet. It's a very simple equation. So the more we can protect and restore woodlands and forests and grasslands, the less we will have to do through energy efficiency, renewables and nuclear and everything else. And of course, a big bit of the carbon out there, and in many ecosystems it is by far the biggest bit. You can't even see it. It's in the ground, it's in the soils. Peatland soils in particular, organic soils, that in many cases have been accumulating carbon from the atmosphere for millennia. Keeping those intact is one of the smartest things we can do and probably one of the cheapest things we can do. And if you keep those ecosystems intact, you get many other benefits besides. And we can even do a great deal through more sensible agriculture. Regenerative agriculture, you might have heard that phrase. And one element of that is about regenerating the soil. What is soil made of? Well, soil is made partly of weathered rock, but a big component of the soil, and it varies from place to place depending on the geology, is made of organic matter. So this is plant remains that have been created by photosynthesis, drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. Those plants die, and if the soil is healthy, a lot of that goes into the soil and creates a flow of organic material, which is feeding the microbes, which are recycling the nutrients. And the more you can get that engine going, the more carbon you can draw down, and the less chemicals you need in terms of fertilizers, which have got their own massive carbon footprint. So win-win-win in terms of soil health, food security, and carbon emissions reductions, if we can only see the connections between carbon, biodiversity, and the health of the system that sustains us. So there's a huge carbon story in all of this, and there's no way you can get to 1.5 degrees as the peak temperature unless we stop deforestation and unless we stop the degradation of ecosystems more broadly. And so those ecosystems that are doing that carbon job, of course, the ones that are in the most natural state, which some still are the reservoir for most of the biodiversity. So we'll have a walk later on down here into the woodland, and you might be able to compare and contrast the wildlife in there compared to the other ecosystems that we'll walk past, the open grass and maybe some fields. And those ecosystems are really the engine room of diversity on this planet. Forests in particular, coral reefs in the ocean, not only, but these places are particularly abundant in species diversity. And that species diversity, well, it's pretty to look at, isn't it? People like me love to go there with their binoculars and make lists and try to understand the ecosystem. actually that is the source of wealth on this planet. So the biodiversity is with us at every stage of our lives and day. So you've all had some food this morning. There's some beautiful pastries over there. They were made in part with wheat. Wheat used to be a wild plant and still remains, fortunately, as a wild plant. Fortunately for us, because we're still extracting genes from the wild ancestors of wheat to be able to refine the varieties that are able to cope with modern challenges, including climate change and diseases that we never knew infected wheat 1,000 years ago. So that biodiversity, all of the food you eat all the time, it is descended from wild species. And those wild species, so long as they're still there, will enable us to not only find new things that we can eat into the future, but also to protect the ones that we've already got through bringing in genetic material from those wild relatives. Because this planet is in a constant flux, constant change. Natural selection is the idea that Charles Darwin coined to help us understand how that change is constantly leading to shifts in the biological material that the planet uses to function. He didn't know about genes, but it's genes we call it today, and those genes are constantly evolving. So if the wild species are evolving, we can use those to evolve our domesticated species and hopefully navigate some of the things that we think are coming down the track. And we've had a couple of glimpses of them recently, including disease in the human world. Equally, that could be affecting crops and the impacts of global warming. These things are very real and they're with us. And one of the insurance policies we've got is that wild genetic resource. A lot of debate about whether we should go GM and genetics and, technology in agriculture. Yeah, it's an interesting debate, but the real thing hardly gets talked about. It's those wild plants and animals that are the ancestors of what we're now eating. Those are the ones we really need to be thinking about, plus the millions of others that may have some benefit that we haven't even discovered yet. Because it's not only food that we're drawing benefit from biodiversity, medicine. About 20% of the drugs you'll get in a pharmacy in the West, they are derived from a wild species. Cone snails that live in the mangrove forests, a frog that lives in a jungle somewhere, some plant that the indigenous people have been using for millennia to treat some illness. These are the kinds of things we're constantly pulling into the pharmaceutical labs to identify new molecules to be able to help us cope with things that are novel to us. And then on top of that, on top of the food and the medical treatments for cancer, heart disease, anxiety, pain relief, you name it, on top of all of that are a series of design challenges that are now being addressed through looking at the innovations created by natural selection. One of my favourite examples is a butterfly I saw in a cloud forest in Colombia some years ago. It's a butterfly called the glasswing. And it's called the glasswing because this insect, when it sits down and opens its wings, you can see straight through it. It's got transparent wings. And the reason for this is to fool insectivorous birds that are hunting in the foliage, looking for something to eat. And this bird evading butterfly, its wings only work because there's no reflection coming off the surface. And the reason for that is because it's got a nanoscale structure on the top of the wing that means the light goes straight through, none of it's reflected, and the butterfly becomes nearly invisible. And this has been an innovation that people have studied with microscopes to create new coatings for solar panels that also have no reflection, thereby making them 10% more efficient. And there are literally thousands of examples like that. Natural selection contributing to welfare, economic benefit and security in the human world. And then there's all sorts of issues linked with the challenges of disease. And, we've just been through this pandemic. It had an origin in the natural world, and there's all sorts of reasons why we should be very worried about that. There was a paper in Nature a few months ago suggesting there's about 50,000 novel viruses out there we haven't described yet, which are potentially going to start shifting as the world warms up into contact with humans through the migration of different species coming into contact in ways they haven't done before. And that pandemic with COVID-19 was a result of a virus coming into contact with something it shouldn't have come into contact with, then jumping into humans. One pathway that's been described is pangolins being illegally traded from the rainforest, the jungles of Central Africa, traded into China for the illegal wildlife trade, coming into contact with bats, being collected for food, kept alive in the so-called wet market. The virus goes from the bat to the pangolin to humans. It evolved inside the pangolin, then jumped into us, causing then a pandemic that's probably going to cost us between, according to the University of Cambridge, between 25 and about $80 trillion over 5 years. This is the level of jeopardy we're running if we don't understand these connections. And of course, one of the things we can do is to keep nature healthy and to keep nature conserved in order to avoid this, because that pandemic is not the only source of disease impacts on the economy. You've heard of Ebola, I guess, repeated outbreaks of that linked to deforestation in Central Africa, with the jumping out of viruses from bats, which wouldn't normally come into contact with people, but the bats are being forced into these tiny remnants of forest where they're much more likely to meet people coming up to the edge farming there. And then you have the Nipah virus. This was a deadly one. Fortunately, it didn't get out of Southeast Asia a few years ago. This was bats again, coming into contact with pigs, where the land had been deforested. The bats were still using the landscape. Bat droppings going onto the ground, getting into pigs, getting into people, causing 70% mortality for those infected. That was a nasty one. Managed to dodge that bullet. SARS in 2003, 2004, that was civets being kept in cages, a kind of arboreal mammal, looks a bit like a cat. They were being kept, you go into the restaurant, I'll have that one please, live animal, take it out, kill it, cook it. That was the source of SARS in China. AIDS came from the bushmeat trade, the killing of gorillas and chimpanzees for meat, going deep into the jungle, coming into contact, blood contact through killing these animals. And then, of course, that became a global emergency as well. There's a load more of that sitting out there. And if we're not careful, we invite it in if we diminish the respect and health of our relationship with the rest of creation that lives on this planet with us. The interactions between different organisms not only help to suppress disease, also to suppress pests. We've become very used in our agriculture over many decades now to be seeing solutions out of bottles of chemicals, when in fact ecological solutions would help to cut emissions, restore nature, and actually improve food security. Many examples from the scientific literature telling us of the value of ladybirds, of lacewings, of barn owls, of songbirds in suppressing different kinds of pests. We need to relearn what our ancestors knew, that actually quite a lot of the answers to food security, they're not in a bottle, they're in a better understanding of how the natural world works. And every now and again we get a little glimpse of this through a scientific study. One of my favourites is by a couple of Dutch ornithologists who published a paper a few years ago looking at the impact of great tits, lovely little colourful birds. They'll be common in the woods around here. And they are voracious predators of caterpillars that damage fruit in the springtime. And so if you've got these birds nearby, you see them. I've got them in my garden in Cambridge, and we have a nest box there. And these birds, about 10 to 12,000 caterpillars they will take to feed one brood of chicks. And if you've got a few apple trees nearby, that's quite a big burden of pest being removed. And so these Dutch ornithologists, they tried to quantify that. Cut a long story short, they got an orchard with apple trees. Half they put into mist nets, so the insects can get in and lay their eggs and the caterpillars will hatch. In the other half, you've got nest boxes to encourage the birds in. So the birds are excluded one side, but the insects not. On the other side, you've got the birds breeding. Cut a long story short, at the end of the season, the harvest, there's 50% more high quality fruit coming out of this side where the birds are present compared with this side where the birds are absent. And this is not to say you don't need any chemicals ever again. It's just a little reminder that what we measure in terms of corporate tax receipts coming from a chemical company putting these substances into the market, we can measure that. We can see the jobs they're creating. We can see that they're globally trading. What we often fail to see is the value of these songbirds. They're in plain sight, but we've lost the ability to see the value that is being created. And similarly with the insects that are part of that same system, you know, this is perhaps the one area where we have had some public understanding of the value of biodiversity lately, is in understanding that relationship between flowering plants and insects in particular, but also birds and mammals up to a point. You know, the truth is that ecosystem out there, all those beautiful flowers, that's part of the ecological glue. And that glue is made to stick via the activities of a vast array of different insects, which are feeding on pollen and feeding on nectar And in so doing, they're transferring genetic material between the plants to enable them to complete their life cycle. And in some ecosystems, like tropical rainforests, the intricacies of this are absolutely epic, with a single species of wasp or bee dependent on a single species of orchid, and the millions of species that exist in that system through a series of interconnections hold the whole thing together. And then once the seeds are produced, once the flowers have been pollinated, the seeds in turn are then being moved around the forest by everything from elephants to marmosets to warthogs to coyotes, little mammal, and all of these animals are part of that same fabric of connections. And that's what makes the whole system work. And if you actually start to remove some of the bigger animals that are moving some of the bigger seeds, there's some great research on this. Over time, it will be a period of hundreds of years, but over time, the biomass of the forest will alter. So you start to diminish that element of the biodiversity and the forest changes. And over time, it will hold much less carbon. And that is then an expense for us because we're going to have to build some new nuclear power stations to replace that service. If only we could see the connection, which very often we can't, unfortunately. But of course, those connections are not only in the health of the wild ecosystems, they're also very much dependent, we are very much dependent on those connections for the health of our domesticated ecosystems, agriculture in particular. Would you believe that 70% of crop plants worldwide are, varieties of crop plants are insect pollinated, and most of them by wild insects? Even in a country like Britain, where we've got loads of honeybee hives, they're still only a minority of the pollinators, and indeed honeybees won't even do things like strawberries. It's bumblebees you need for that, wild insects. Massively underestimate that value. There is a piece of work by the so-called Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. This was a piece of work that the G7 put into train in 2007, led by a former director of Deutsche Bank, to try and dig into all of this. They started to generate a few numbers around the value of different ecosystem services, which is largely what I'm talking about. And they discovered that in the case of pollination, wild insects are adding about $200 billion worth of value globally to the economy in terms of food security. And so this is really quite a large number. And you know, some people say, well, how do you generate such a huge number? Surely these silly little insects aren't generating that kind of value. Well, if you start looking at a few examples of where that service has been withdrawn, that's when you start to see where they get those big numbers from. One of the examples I looked at was the case in southwestern China, where during the 1980s they had very heavy pesticide use to try and control various insect pests, and they killed all the bumblebees. And so now, nearly 40 years later, if you go there in the springtime, you'll find the farmers, the fruit farmers, climbing in the trees with a long stick with a feather duster on the end, moving the pollen between the blossoms by hand because the bumblebees have gone. That's when you can start to see the economic cost of removing some of these bits of the ecosystem. 20 fruit farmers needed to replace the work of one bumblebee nest. And we're destroying these things with absolute abandon, as though somehow this is of benefit to the economy and to human well-being. It is utterly the opposite. And even when you get beyond food security and the value of pollinators and healthy soils, the synergy between all of that and carbon, there's an even bigger thing, you may say, water supply. Where does the water come from? Well, here, I think we've become too used to thinking it comes out of taps and increasingly out of plastic bottles, unfortunately. But the truth is it's coming out of nature, all of it. The fresh water on this planet is a tiny little sliver of the total water. Nearly all of it is salt water. It's being recycled by ecosystems, starting with ocean plankton drifting in the surface of the sea, which basically seed clouds. And clouds is the main medium whereby evaporated and then condensed water gets moved around the planet. And then it's being recycled by forests back into the atmosphere, flowing into continental interiors. Much of the food supply of North America and indeed South America is sustained by the Amazon rainforest. That's a vast pump putting colossal quantities of water into the atmosphere every day, about 25 billion tons of water going into the atmosphere as a result of that rainforest doing what it does. And that water's travelling. Some of it's going as far as Manitoba in Canada, watering the Great Plains of North America, a massive breadbasket. Similarly, down in the La Plata Basin, wheat and maize up here, maize and soya beans down there, being watered by this rainforest, and yet the president of Brazil seems to think it's a good idea to cut it down for national development. I mean, He may not care about food supply, but when he starts getting blackouts, which they have been doing in Brazil, as a result of the rainforest being cleared, there's less rain, there's therefore less river, and if 60% of your electricity is coming from hydroelectric dams, you have a problem. I have tried to explain. There is a connection. Rain, rainforest. It's not an accident. These two things are connected. Please try to understand that as you're thinking about food and energy security. We've been hearing a lot about food and energy security lately, haven't we? As if environmental security's got nothing to do with it. I'm afraid it's got absolutely everything to do with it. And the more we degrade the system that's sustaining us, the more we jeopardize the future of our social fabric. It's that simple. I mean, this stuff has been seen as like an environmental issue for all of my career. It's not. It's an economic issue of the most fundamental importance, and we need to start acting as if that were the case, because we have the science. And increasingly, we have the kind of collective social experience, don't we? That pandemic, which we've just been through, you know, we now know at a kind of much more intuitive level, collectively, the value of nature to society. We've got a lot of data on this. We collect vast amounts of it at Natural England, looking at people's experience in the natural world and the extent to which we get psychological and physical well-being benefits. I saw a number yesterday, which has been produced by some academics. Every pound invested in access to the natural environment, you get £7 value back for the National Health Service. Did you see last week the headlines about all the antidepressants shooting up? Massive increase, a massive spike in these substances now being prescribed to help people feel better. And one of the reasons they don't feel good is because they don't have that balance of daily experiences which nurture the human spirit. And one of those things is nature. We've been living in it for 99.9% of human existence. Only over the last couple of hundred years have we decided to seal ourselves off in air-conditioned cars and gyms and cities. And this is one of the reasons why we're finding it, I think, in the modern world, quite a stressful place to be. So blending nature back into the fabric of where we go every day. And this is why this is such an important agenda for everyone in this room. Housing, retail, infrastructure. These are the places where we have to put nature. It's not only about saving the Amazon, it is about that. But we've got to bring back nature to where people are, because people do much better when they have nature in their lives. And this is something that can be done at the same time as catching carbon, as cleaning up the water, as reducing flood risk, as well as bringing back missing and disappearing species. All of these things need to be seen as part of the same agenda. And this is why at Natural England we've now embarked on a new phase of our work. For many years we were an organisation committed to conservation, which is about hanging on to the remnants of what's left, a rare species of beetle living here, a small population of rare birds over there, a piece of ancient woodland somewhere else. We're going to draw lines on maps, we're going to regulate, we're going to try and hang on to that. And we continue to do that. This is a vital part of our work, make no mistake. But now what we're talking about is nature recovery, because the simple fact is, if we want to do all these things that we know we need to do for our health, our wealth and our security in terms of food and the sustenance of infrastructure at a time of climate change and in terms of public health and water, we need more nature, not less. It's no longer enough to say what we've got just needs to be protected. We've got to push it back up, recreate the abundance, recreate the vibrancy of ecosystems. And it's possible that we're just in time to do that, even in a country like Britain. A lot of what we once had still hangs on. It's now in smaller populations, isolated pockets, and this is why we're now talking about a nature recovery network being at the centre of what we need to do and to facilitate working with partners across multiple sectors, especially private businesses, but also the conservation organisations, other government departments and agencies, to be able to create a transformation in the health of nature in this country, which is now one of the most depleted in the world. And the Nature Recovery Network is about having more spaces rich in nature, about having bigger ones and having them in better state, looked after for the biodiversity, and then having connected together with one another. And this is the very exciting piece, is the extent to which, by working together, we can do all of that, especially that connectivity piece. Because the truth is, there is not one single institution in this country, not even the mighty British government, that can wave a wand and say we will have nature recovery. It doesn't work like that. This country is owned and managed by tens of thousands of different entities, some of them private, some of them public, some of them charities, all with different objectives, but what we have to find a way of doing is bringing the same objective across all of those different actors to recover nature. And for all of those people managing land, if we come together, we can do this. And it's something that at Natural England we're already beginning to see the embryo of that idea growing very rapidly. More and more people coming in. The Nature Recovery Network Delivery Partnership that we set up recently, Ground Control is a member of that. We now have 650 organisations in there. We had a fantastic meeting yesterday up in Middlesbrough. And one of the striking things there, including coming from the local government, was the extent to which the penny does seem to have finally dropped in different places. This is not an environmental issue, at least not only. This is about economic renewal, it's about social regeneration, and ultimately it's about the salvation of civilization. It's really that big, and people are beginning to understand that. So my message here is, please do understand that this is your business, not just Natural England, and it is literally business. This is about managing risk, it's about securing opportunities, and it's about being a little bit more thoughtful and creative about how we think about these subjects. Fortunately, what you have is a fantastic partner in the form of Ground Control, who have the people and the expertise, and most importantly, the passion and the mission to do this with you. But you're going to have to open your eyes a little bit and just try and put some of the things that maybe shape your thinking now to one side. You know, are you worried that the customers might think things look a bit untidy? Well, they might do, but explain to them this is a planetary emergency, or at least explain to them there's some beautiful butterflies to look at when they come out of the shop. These are the kinds of things we now need to start to navigate, but it's going to require us to put old thinking behind us and start to adopt some new thinking fit for the 21st century that we're now in, which is a time of crisis. And one of those crises is an ecological one, but fortunately, it's possible to fix it. Thank you very much indeed. I'll stop there and we'll take any questions, won't we, later.
Well, that is an incredibly hard act to follow. Tony, thank you so much. I recently met a wonderful wildlife vet who studied with Tony decades ago, and I felt this this tinge of jealousy to have been able, you know, how do you bottle this up and take these lessons everywhere? Anyone who's been with Tony when he has been lecturing, our businesses he's been a direct consultant to, but what a wealth of information, knowledge, experience, and to take all of that and boil it down into chunks that resonate with, I'm sure, everyone in this room, certainly me. How does nature apply to us, impact us? Why is it important? Tony, thank you. Pleasure. We are here as property owners, many of us, and how does ground control fit into all of this? Well, I mean, we make a lot of money cutting grass, to be quite honest. That's how the business started almost 50 years ago. Vegetation management, grounds management, and we have expanded into a bunch of different service lines from design and build, fencing, EV installation for electric vehicle charging installation, et cetera. But the bulk of the business and how we, you know, pay our payroll is based on maintaining the natural environment. While we're doing all that, we have been pushing for years to do that in a different way with our customers who own the land. And that has to be a partnership because we actually are just a supplier at the end of the day. But I see such a sea change that's extremely exciting and heartwarming because now all the messages Tony has shared today, how can we do things in a different way that is better for nature, not just the same old way, which is quite destructive and inhospitable for anything to live on. And so the next part of this morning, we are going to have panelists from Severn Trent Water, from Lower Thames Crossing, which is the highways agency, Chris, our very own Chris Baldry, who's been with Ground Control for over 20 years, first as a landscape architect, then as running our design and build business up to 30 million pounds, and then retrained as a forester, and now does woodland creation and is the brains behind Wildfell and on the execution side. We have guest appearances from Make It Wild, Helen Neve, who is, I think, in the hospital, you know, prayers are with her, who can't be here, but she's beamed in, and also Liv Garfield, the CEO of Severn Trent Water, who is such a leading force. Tony's a great advisor to Liv. Ricky's here from that. So I'd like to welcome our panelists up on stage right now. What is really exciting, ground control is this glue. So we have the businesses that we run, but we touch 55,000 sites throughout the UK for our hundreds and hundreds of customers. And not only can we do the things they need us to do for health and safety to keep infrastructure running, but we can help advise them and work with them on nature's recovery. So I'd like to introduce Matt Palmer, the lead executive on the Lower Thames Crossing, who's going to talk about, many people don't seem to know about this incredible project to cut traffic on the M25 and have a cut through to the south of England to go over to across the channel. Ricky Dallow from Severn Trent Water is leading everything on the environmental initiatives around the Commonwealth Games, and he's going to talk more about that, and Chris Bawtry. The theme of this project is, what does landscape managed for nature mean within your organizations? We're going to start with the pre-recorded insight from Liv at Severn Trent Water.
I'm Liv Garfield, Chief Executive of Severn Trent, and I'm so sorry I can't be there today because I know what wonderful work Ground Control does in this exact arena. Now, biodiversity is right at the heart of our strategy. We genuinely believe that for any business to get to net zero, then the other side of the coin is biodiversity, it's nature. So we say consistently as an organisation, what's good for nature is good for water. Now, I thought I'd share a couple of things that we're doing, not on any level other than just, I sometimes think other people's ideas help spark that magic idea for yourself. So the journey that we've been on and the ideas that we've come out with are as follows. So the first thing is that we're a proud regional employer. There's not many companies actually headquartered in the Midlands, and to have the Commonwealth Games this year meant that we felt that we had to kind of step into that space and make sure that we hosted the Games as an area, but actually we left a legacy thereafter. And that's why we committed to work with the Commonwealth Games Partnership to create an ongoing legacy of 2,022 acres of trees. Now, see what we've done there, 2022, and we're well on track with doing that. Now, of course, that will create an amazing carbon sequestration situation for the future, as well as a wonderful amenity for the public. So that's one of the first things we've done, is to think of nature as a legacy act. The second thing, of course, is to think about it with your net zero plans. And that's why we've committed to really making biodiverse, remaking biodiverse, I should say in some sense, 5,000 hectares of land. And we've actually delivered that 5 years ahead of target, and we'll be completing in the next few months, and we gave ourselves till 2027 to do that. Now that's an area the size of Gloucester, and it's 1% of the national efforts that Natural England is trying to lead on. But we know actually there's an even more special activity you can do in biodiversity, and that's around peatland restoration. And because we know that that has multiple times the benefits of anything else in space, we also committed to 2,000 acres of peatland restoration. Now, we know actually that nature has brilliant health benefits. We all know during the course of lockdowns that we walked our dogs more than ever before. In my case, I got a dog just to walk the dog, right? And we know that people really connect with nature. And so in inner city urban areas, we also want to create little hotspots, little kind of enclaves where you can see nature at work. And that's why we've also created 72 tiny forests, which are right in the heart of city centres, giving that passion to people living a more urban lifestyle. I hope that's brought to you three things to life. One is that there are a series of big, bold commitments. We believe that's the only answer in the biodiversity arena, is to go big and bold. The second thing is, it's hugely empowering and engaging for your organisation. Severn Trent adores this activity and these commitments. And the third thing is that actually you can do things that make a real difference for your business commercially. So our net zero ambition we believe to be an ongoing long-term commercial plan, and biodiversity is part of that. So it's not just out of the goodness of our hearts, we do it with that commercial lens as well. Thank you for listening, and I hope today goes great.
Thank you to Liv. Liv is celebrating her 20th wedding anniversary today, and selfishly chose that instead of being here with us, but we are delighted to have Ricky. Ricky, will you take about 2 minutes and just walk through the initiatives that you're managing? Liv touched on many of them, and talk about what landscapes managed for nature means to you at Severn Trent Water.
Yeah, of course. So first of all, I'm Ricky Dallow, Forest Creation Lead for Severn Trent, and I work within the environment team, which for those who are based not in the Midlands, Severn Trent occupy from the Welsh border across to Leicester, from Gloucester all the way up to the Humber. So a good chunk of the Midlands and a bit here, there and everywhere. And 2 years ago, we made the pledge to work with the Commonwealth Games as a nature and carbon neutral legacy sponsor for that Games. Ultimately, the trees weren't in the ground by the time of the Games, so it's all about leaving a carbon neutral legacy going forward. So over the next 35 years, the 2,022 acres we will be planting will sequester all the carbon emitted from the Games, which is happening in T-minus 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And the idea behind that is that it'll be the first one of its kind. And I know Paris and even Qatar World Cup, everyone's hopping on that bandwagon. So all of the work we're doing, along with the Commonwealth Games around their carbon baselining, is the first of its kind, and it's being pushed forward across here, there and everywhere as well, which is great. Ultimately, that is covered on larger tracts of land, so it's 2,000 acres. For those who work in hectares, it's about 818 hectares. That won't happen within inner city areas. So what we looked at is how can we engage with communities, particularly those which are socially deprived of green spaces, in and around Birmingham or other city centres within our region, and understand where can we work with them where they haven't got acres and acres to plant trees or do any other biodiversity improvements we may do. So we looked at the tiny forest schemes. So those who aren't sure what a tiny forest is, it's the same size as a tennis court. It's a perfect example behind you over there as well. And the idea behind that is it's based on the Dr. Miyawaki method. So all you need is 200 metres squared, 600 trees within that region. It's all focused around community engagement, community monitoring. What are the benefits of those tiny forests? So our Commonwealth Games target, if you like, is to make the games carbon neutral, but actually trees, as Tony said before, so much more than that. So we're looking at biodiversity. So what biodiversity improvements will we see in these little tiny forests, which are kind of like forest schools? So we've planted 72 across our region in schools, community groups, scout troops, anywhere. Looking at mental health and well-being. How can we allow children in to look at forest schools? How will they understand nature going forward? And hopefully, well, I know a lot of them are eco-warriors now, and hopefully pushing that and looking after these forests as well. So it's very much a combined approach with ground control, with our partners at Earthwatch as well, to make sure that these are happening and we're not letting anyone kind of be neglected by the Commonwealth Games programme. So that is, in short, what our forestry ambitions are. But wider than that, as Liv said, we're targeted to, we've already exceeded it, the 5,000 hectares of biodiversity improvement. That is based on what land's available. So that could be peatland restoration, could be wetland, could be tree planting. Ultimately, it's what's right for that environment as well. So we've got a whole host of teams. The idea with Liv saying that go big is probably the best way, mainly because I wouldn't be here if she didn't say go big. But it's making sure that bringing resource, bringing the supply chain along with that, and working with pioneers like Ground Control who've got net zero plans similar to us, and working together to make sure that the landscape is recovering and it's working what that landscape is currently doing in line with your objectives as well. So
That's fascinating. Thank you so much, Ricky. Next, I'd like to have Matt Palmer talk about the greenest road ever to be built.
Yes, so hi, I'm Matt Palmer. I'm the Exec Director for National Highways, looking after Lower Thames Crossing. I must admit, it could be a very hostile gig, this, a road builder. And so, just a little bit on Lower Thames Crossing. As Kim says, it's to alleviate Dartford. It's the largest road project since the M25. Historically, we haven't done roads very well in this country. We could all list off sort of Twyford Down and a number of other great projects that have completely looked at one side of the dimension, the economic side. So my challenge is to try and pragmatically take what is an economic project and take Tony's words, really. How do you be creative and do the broader thing? I'm so glad, Tony, you said we can talk about nature rather than biodiversity, because A, I struggle to spell it, and B, I've always wondered quite what it is. So how do I balance nature and deliver a 23-kilometre road, £8 billion worth of investment? And it's a journey. These are long established projects that take a long time to deliver. We've been around designing this for 10 years at least. We've got another 10 years before it comes to fruition in terms of open. And so what we've done through that time is work with partners really to try and understand what we need to do. And I think, I do think the world is changing. I think 10 years ago, this certainly the project I'm on and projects other people are on would have been talked about cost and time. And nature might have been there as a sort of footnote. It probably wouldn't even be a footnote. I think we're now at a slight tipping point. I think people are talking about it. And what that's allowed me to do is actually say, right, there's a much rounder, richer conversation. And there is no longer economic gain and cost. There's economic gain and cost, there's carbon and there's nature. And we're talking about that much more generally. So not talking about carbon, but I suppose then talking about what we're trying to do on Lower Thames Crossing. And we recognise that road builders don't have a good reputation, so we're trying to prove that we're different. So the first thing we've done, we haven't even got planning permission for the road. We've gone out and bought a farm, which is an interesting story in itself, down at Brentwood, so 10 miles away. We've got 100 hectares of land, which we're going to start planting up this year. And we'll carry on through planning permission for the road, but we'll get that into service. We're public open space, and we're working with Forestry England to sort of out to consultation really to understand what the community wants, etc. So that's the first piece. Then overall, we'll bring on about 1,000 acres of compensatory or mitigatory planting, also land. About half of it's public access, so trying to deal with this, how do we get greater connectivity, so how do we do that sympathetically? And I have to say, you know, that on that journey, and certainly the journey I've only been on the project for 2 years, and in that 2 years, I've seen the real benefit of sort of working with partners, in particular Natural England, actually, if I'm honest. They've pushed and encouraged us down journey, you know, avenues that we wouldn't have gone before. And so it's about having, you know, creating fertile, creative teams that will listen and follow the journey. And that's hopefully what we've done. Now, we won't be perfect. We've got a long way to go, and we want to be with partners like Ground Control, etc., who can help us, you know, go further on this journey. This is not, you know, we've got to a point now, as I say, with 1,000 acres that we're going to start looking at planting up, etc. But there'll be more we can do as we go forward. More generally, just sort of a footnote for sort of National Highways more generally. So Lower Thames is part of that, but it's the largest project. National Highways more generally is looking at how does it go to positive gain in terms of biodiversity over the next 5 years, etc. Really interesting challenge. Again, it's challenging us in terms of how our operations think, how our projects think. And again, we haven't got the answers, but we want to go on the journey. We're trying to go on the journey.
It's fascinating. Thank you so much, because I just looked at the YouTube or the website videos and plans for this, and the road is quite extraordinary. You should take a look, not only on the scale of the infrastructure, but that there's bridges for nature going across the Lower Thames crossing. It's going under the Thames. Everything they're doing to try and mitigate negative impact on nature, but also put things in place for positive impact on nature. And it's extraordinary, and I hope it all happens as the plans currently look. So thank you for sharing that. Chris and Philip and I, when we launched the Evergreen Fund, and we were looking for landowners, because we made a commitment as part of this 5% of our profits going into green carbon reducing technology investments, along with 100,000 pounds a year for tree planting. We thought all of our commercial customers would just open the doors and say, yes, plant here, and it was super tough. So then we had to look a bit further afield, and we met Make It Wild, Chris and Helen Neve up in the Yorkshire Dales, and we helped them with a super hedge. But Helen can't be here today. She's supposed to be on the panel, but she's sent a video message to talk about that project. But it's an example of a private landowner who has a commitment to do things to support nature. And they've just had wonderful inroads. So over to Helen now via video link.
I think that supporting biodiversity is one of the most important things that we can do as business people, as entrepreneurs, as custodians of the land. We are in a climate and ecological emergency. We're in the 6th mass extinction. And if we don't look after biodiversity, there is no future for us. Some of the things we're doing at Make It Wild to support biodiversity are protecting our ancient woodland, planting thousands of new trees, digging ponds, putting up bird boxes. We have a rewilding section, about 60 acres under rewilding, where we have belted galloways and Exmoor ponies, and they have supported the return of all kinds of wildflowers, which in turn supports insects, which are fundamental to our ecosystem. And really, Make It Wild was set up for this very thing. It was set up to bring nature back. So it's absolutely fundamental to everything that we do.
Helen and Chris have been living this dream for 15 years. They were a very successful entrepreneur in Chris's case, and in Helen's case, a doctor. And with their kids, they started planting trees. They involved the communities all around where they lived, and now they're getting all sorts of business sponsorships for this, and they're very similar to the Knepp Estate down in Sussex. They are raising considerable income off the tourism of Make It Wild. So yoga retreats, willow fence making projects, woodland walks, meditation, etc., because that impact on humans is so vitally important. Finally, I'm delighted to have Chris talk in an well, not air conditioned, but a cool space, a bit about what we've done here and also about the Wildfell Center for Environmental Recovery. Chris.
Thank you, Kim. Good morning, everyone. From ground control's perspective, caring for our environment is our core purpose. So we're absolutely focused on that and dedicated to driving that through. And part of our strategy is to enhance nature wherever we can. And we're very fortunate as a business to be operating in an area where we're delivering landscape management across a number of sectors through our GM business, through our utility, Arb Rail, and also creating new landscapes through our design and consultancy business. And in terms of what we're doing as a business, I see us delivering in three main areas. The first of those is working with our clients. So we're very fortunate to have a huge range of clients. We're working with Ricky on the tiny forests and the legacy forests. We're working with Network Rail on their biodiversity projects, National Highways with their pollinator partnerships, pollinator corridors, sorry. And also we've just finished a project with Tesco, a national tree planting project. So it's great to have that influence and be able to help those customers deliver on the ground. We're also, as Kim mentioned already, we're investing through our Evergreen Fund. So Helen and Chris's Make It Wild was an early investment. We're supporting the Essex Forest Initiative, obviously Essex-based tree planting. We're working with the Cotswolds National Landscape and also supporting Highlands Rewilding, two really fantastic projects up in Scotland. And the third area is what I call our own projects. So it started off with Little Cowbridge Wood and Little Cowbridge Grange, so 35 acres, 35-acre site where we're really focusing on green gains. We've got our 22 acres of new woodland that we've created, but also really looking at all those opportunities for biodiversity, or should I say nature recovery, around the site. And also sort of really excitingly is our flagship scheme up at Wildfell. So the 300-acre site that we launched this time last year, which is our centre for environmental recovery. And just to give you a quick update on where we are with that project now, we're finalising our designs for the scheme. So we're looking at 120 acres of woodland creation, so new, predominantly broadleaf woodland. We've got 100 acres of habitat creation, so looking at really building on the biodiversity and delivering biodiversity net gain in a measurable way. And also bringing the 55 acres of woodland, existing woodland, back into management. And in terms of progress, we've just completing our baselining at the moment, really important. So for habitat, protected species, for pollinators, for carbon, for soil health. So really establish where we are at the moment so we can show the progress that we make. Also, we've started off actually planting some trees. So we did our COP26 very imaginatively, planted 26 trees in our First Avenue. And then we've also planted, in conjunction with one of our client partners, Briggs Equipment, 750 metres of new native hedgerows. So we have started on the ground, and then we'll be rolling into the autumn where things are really going to kick off in terms of getting the deer fencing infrastructure in, getting seeding done, first phase of tree planting, and pond creation and hedgerow planting. So a really exciting sort of build up to getting schemes on the ground and demonstrate different techniques of achieving this nature recovery in reality.
That's fantastic. I mean, along with, Chris listed a long list of things he's involved with within ground control. There's also the nature partnerships and the farming clusters that he's involved with those networks. So there's so many points of contact. With Chris and Philip and I, we have were weekly meetings when we launched the Evergreen Fund, and now they're monthly and occasionally around updates. But for years, we sat on the ground control board talking about revenue, like what are we making, what are we getting paid, how are we growing, and now we talk about, okay, how much are we spending? And it's so exciting. There are even more exciting conversations on what we're investing for nature. We bought a 300-acre farm that, wasn't inexpensive to do, but also all the investments that we're making to plant trees for others on other pieces of property, along with what we're doing there. And it feels great. This is a very diverse panel in that you have, we are a private commercial company. We're privately held, and because of the values alignment, we can do whatever we decide to do. With Severn Trent Water, there's a wide range of shareholders, and they have different pressures. A government agency, Helen and Chris. So there's a wide range of people, but all looking towards the same things. I mean, I talked to Tony on Monday. I said, what are some good questions for these panelists? And he said, when you're designing something from scratch, so this is a question for Matt, how can you really think about nature in a different way? We're all trying to reverse engineer, like what can we do to mitigate damage that we're doing? I mean, when you're starting from scratch, what can you do?
I mean, I think it's really interesting because I sort of alluded to it earlier. This is a long stand. These projects take a long time, and priorities wax and wane through those. Governments move on, etc. And what we need to do now, and I think we were at a point in the country where the awareness is such that we can have carbon and nature can be prioritised at the top of the sort of, no longer is it sort of triangle or a, whatever you want to show. We've got multiple things we need to prioritise. That said, I do think Lower Thames Crossings have done a good job of actually migrating itself to prioritise nature from having started on a very much an economic grounds. So that would be my sort of key point. It's about how you maximise, you make sure you've got the priorities right at the start. But then actually what are we doing? So 23 kilometres of road. This is not an insignificant road. It's 3 lanes in each way. It's 60 metres wide. It's quite a scar. And so we've stood back and said, okay, so how do we, first off, minimise carbon? Well, the way you do that on a big road scheme is you pick the material up you need to move out of the way, and you keep it on site, so you keep it close. So actually, of our road, 80% of it is below ground or behind bunds. So what that then does from a nature perspective means, A, you can't see the road. We are often criticised actually for not showing true photographs or portrayals of the future of the road. The reality is you can't see it. And by the way, when you drive down it, you can't see off it. So it's not, this isn't built for the drivers. It's built for the community around it, built for nature around it. So you won't get to see the Thames. There won't be lovely views. What you'll get to see is bunds, pretty much, as I say, 80% along the way. We only go above ground twice, where we go over a railway line and over a river. That's it. But that then allows you a huge opportunity to then do really interesting stuff. And the bit we keep on pushing at is how do you work with partners to do the right thing in the right locality. And we've done everything, and we are doing more. So through Thurrock, we're picking up landfill sites and planting those in conjunction with Thurrock Council. Down in the southern end, so towards the Thames, we end up with lots of material coming out of the tunnels itself. So we're trying to restore some of the historic views that you would have had along the Thames back in the sort of 15th century before London put all its landfill down by Tilbury. So we're creating, I was going to say dollops, it's probably not the right term, small hills, so let's say, but they're 20 metre high hills which will afford you views down the Thames and across to the Ramsar site, so an area of, importance to birds, etc., and wildlife. And then so that's sort of, I'm talking very much about nature, but then again, you go, how can you map your engineering to be better? And again, we were challenged very early on about actually is a tunnel or is it a bridge? Well, actually, a tunnel is much less impactful. Downside of that, of course, it's heavy concrete, more carbon. So we got a challenge on carbon. But we ended up extending the tunnel to really miss not just the Ramsar, which is where the birds, with the designated area the birds land. Birds don't land just in the designated areas. So the associated land, we've pushed the tunnel way up the hill, so almost a kilometre up the hill, to avoid that sort of that impact. And it has benefits from the community, etc. But so engineering can be used to do the right thing. And then the last bit you mentioned, we've created these 7 bridges, or I get confused between is the tunnel a bridge, a nature bridge, but we have sort of 6 of these large crossing bridges. The largest being 80 metres, which is all about connectivity between existing woodlands. And it's probably the best we can do. You've got a 60-metre wide road. How do you make sure that invertebrates, dormice, etc., bats, all cross it? So we've got a football pitch wide bridge that horses will be able to ride over without noticing the road below, where you would have trees and you'll have a cycle path and you'll have a small country road going next to you. So we've tried to use engineering it for the good in nature. Now, as I said before, we haven't got the solutions. We've got a first step along the journey. We're learning from every other infrastructure project that's going on at the moment, and we'll continue to learn. And that's how do we continue to create and challenge ourselves? Because the danger of these big projects, I was creating an entity that's going to be around for 10 years, and if it's fixated in today's thinking, then it won't learn as we go forward. So how do we sort of chart that path? And that's what we're currently out to do. We're trying to bring together the supply chain in a way that will actually understand that they've got to carry on challenging. So ancient woodland's a really good example of that. Yes, we have an impact on ancient woodland. Yes, we've minimised it, but we can do it better and better and less and less. And so I want all of our contractors to get intimate with all our vintage trees. I want to have explicit conversations about how we avoid every single one. And I don't want us to be lazy and do a tree clearance just because it's what's shown on the map. Let's make sure we actually really understand that we need to do these things. And so let's ramp up the awareness of the population that will work on Lower Thames to actually the importance of nature. So we'll have 10,000 people at peak, 22,000 people over the life of the project. And if we can leave a legacy in their minds of actually how important nature is and how nature and construction come together. I've been in construction 30 years. I can tell you it doesn't come together in many people's minds in construction. So if I can leave 22,000 people understanding that no longer is it about cost and time, it's about cost, time and sustainability. And that's what we're trying to do. So that's not really answering your question.
That's fantastic. No, that was excellent. That's excellent. So the forward planning, and I love the comment about let's make sure it's loose enough that we can incorporate what we're learning as we go. My next question is actually for Chris. You've covered so many different roles within ground control. What would you have done differently now from this position that we really have learned a lot? Most of our learning comes from mistakes, at least for me. So what would you have done differently, not just on Wildfell and with the woodland creation, but anything that you've touched?
Yeah, I think from a woodland creation perspective and how we developed this site, I was very focused on one single objective, which was I'd just done a forestry course. I wanted to create my first woodland, so it was all about woodland and planting trees. And that was sort of, I think, very narrow-minded in hindsight. And I think what we've learned over the 4 years as we've been establishing those trees is the broader site. So really looking at a site in terms of all those existing features that we should be developing. It's not just about those new trees, my babies that we're growing on. It's the existing hedgerows. What can we do with those existing features in terms of letting them grow out, letting them develop, the grasslands, the ponds, the river corridors. So I think it's sort of broadening those objectives to make the most of the site, and I think that's a lot of the things that we've learned and we've carried over onto Wildfell. And I think as well from what we've learned, it's about establishing that baseline effectively. So really looking at what we've got so that we can measure improvements, we can demonstrate improvements to other people that want to do similar projects. So it's establishing obviously where we are in terms of biodiversity currently and what we can do to really develop that and get our scheme to work around that. So it's about sort of developing that learning and getting the most out of our sites. And I think as well that we can get quite hamstrung as a business in terms of grounds maintenance, for example, where we're tied into performance and frequency specifications. We've got to cut the grass this many times. We've got to clip back the hedgerows to that specification. We need to sort of turn that on its head a little bit and look at how we can develop those sites for nature. And I think it's being a bit more of a adaptive approach to management to really develop that and think about it in a different way. And as Tony said, being good for nature is good for people. So, if you want to sit outside at your lunch break To my mind, it's much better to look at a slightly untidy area of grassland that's full of butterflies than marvel at the straight line, sort of Wimbledon Centre Court, stripes in grass, for example.
That's fantastic. I mean, Chris talked about our purpose is caring for the environment. Ground Control, we've always said we put people at the center of everything we do, care for the environment. It was sort of messy, and our new team that's running the business now put it together so succinctly, human nature, because it's all about people and planet. And when those are working harmoniously, what a difference. Ricky is my next question specifically for you. So that, for everybody that is in business here, what is the return on investment? This does cost money, but what is the return on investment specifically for Severn Trent on these wonderful initiatives you're doing around the Commonwealth Games?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I'll add another catchphrase is that, as Liv alluded to before, what's good for nature is good for water. And at the head of our supply chain is the water, which we all drink, we all use, and it's our core business model, as we all pay bills, and that's our key business approach. For us, we've got to listen to our regulators, our shareholders, and also looking at what our customers want. Aside from cheap bills, what else do they want us to do as a regulator, as a landowner, as someone who can potentially bring a lot of parties together to make sure that we can deliver anything around nature and improvements around there. So for us is that for every £1 we spend on nature, we will have a significant saving back on chemical reduction, water quality issues, leakage reduction, which in turn then leads to a better or a easier to get net zero and pass those cost savings on to our customers as well. So it's looking at all of the work we can do around nature recovery, nature creation, nature improvement, either on our own land or with third parties or within our supply chain to make sure that we can help things at the source. So with that is that we've launched with Anglian Water a Get River Nature Positive scheme, which looks at why are rivers not reaching good ecological status, and ultimately we are a contributing factor to that along with other landowners and users of that. So to understand improving those river quality, one, will have a great impact with our local communities, as we're an organisation very similar to some here who never really get a great good feedback, and they always speak to you when they've got a complaint, and it's trying to change that view of companies along that sense, but also creating 50 kilometres of Bavon River quality across two sites within the Midlands to start that getting that stuff sorted. And hopefully by making these big bold pledges alongside other organisations, we can help start that investment, that drive, similar to what Tony said, is that this is happening now, whether we like it or not, it needs to happen. Other ways we've looked at doing it is working with other partners and understanding that our core business is water. When it comes to the environment, it comes to air quality, everything else, it's engaging other people to make sure so for example, our Tiny Forest and Legacy Forest project, our job was to make it carbon neutral. Carbon neutral was the clue in the name there, but actually there's potential other income streams, revenues, capitalisation on opportunities, looking at things like air quality, similar to what Tony said before, around £1 spent equals £7 reduction in mental health costs and that sort of thing. So to understand what you can do as a business and an organisation, and with that is that we are doing a natural capital survey on our whole estate, which is around 50,000 acres, to understand what is our land, what are we doing with it, what are the opportunities here. Similar to what Chris is doing at the Wildflower Centre, is to understand how can we add value to our land holdings, many of which are around reservoirs which are hugely populated, but particularly with the weather like it is today, to understand how can we add value to people and showcase that Severn Trent, yes, it's a water company. Our core business is all of the infrastructure which the lovely Victorians put in way back when, but there's so much more to it than that. So it's looking at the bigger picture of how could you capitalise on potential income streams, may that be through the Forest Commission or private investors, or with the change in tide of ESG and what investors want to see from companies, it's capitalising and listening to people what they want, and with that will come opportunities as well.
That's fantastic, thank you. I'm going to answer the question I just asked Ricky for ground control. when we do the right thing around purpose-driven business, so whether that's investment in our people development, mental health initiatives, biodiversity and nature, tree planting, the Evergreen Fund, whenever we do the things that we love to do, because they feel good and they feel right, the return on those investments are enormous. And they're enormous in a bunch of things. One is we're able to attract the very best people. We punch so far above our weight in attracting world-class talent to join a little landscaping company based in Billericay, Essex. I mean, go figure. So and again, everyone that's here today, thank you for joining us on this journey, but it has made all the difference to focus on purpose over, practice. And the second thing is, and is just as important, is our customers. We've only ever won work on price for years and years. I mean, this business is running almost 50 years. We won because we were the lowest price provider, including our customers in this TP and online today. We are now increasingly competing for work based on values, not value for money, because our customers care. They care about doing the right thing around how people are treated, health and safety, especially how we're treating the planet and how we're interacting with nature. And what a sea change and how exciting. So this is like, preaching to the choir. It truly is, because everyone here, we're already aligned on this stuff. So how do we get more of this out into the wider world? And it's forming exemplars. So we do our little bit here, what Lower Thames Crossing, the Highways Agency, not only on that project, but with the Pollinator Pathways, Severn Trent Water, and many of the other partners in the Environment Agency are really fighting the really good fight. Tony and all the wildlife trusts, the government agencies, for everyone just to raise the volume about what they're doing and then do the cross-pollination. So thank you so much, wonderful panelists. I have sat through American baseball games. I want everybody to stand up, stretch your legs. It's like the Mexican wave. Just stretch your legs. We have 20 more minutes with mapping to show how these networks for nature can come together. And we're going to focus on one county, true to our hearts, Essex. So I'd like to thank our panelists again. Warm welcome. Round of applause. And introduce Matt Noakes, our technical director for Environmental Services, and Jack Potter. Jack's recently joined us, and they're going to show and talk to you about how we are thinking of joining up all these different 55,000 sites with a lot of linear infrastructure. And pictures are worth 1,000 words. They're going to show you the images on that, okay? Thank you so much.
Fantastic.
Hey guys, thank you. We are super excited to have this slot just to share with you really what we believe is possible and actually bring that to life through visual aids and mapping. And we've got the clicker here, and we're going to refer to the screen quite a bit, because actually bringing this to life is so important through visual images and stuff. But actually, what the important message here is today is actually, let's click through. Not working. There we go. What the important message here today is actually we in this room as businesses and organisations can lead that change. As we've heard from the panel and Tony, we can make a difference here and how we take this forward. It's just catching up. So I think there's 3 takeaways I want to take away from here today. The first one is actually how there's an increased sense of purpose of how we can come together and contribute to nature recovery, but at scale. At scale is the big part here, and actually how we connect there. Also how theoretical modelling can help give informed decision-making about what we do on our sites, but also the impact of that beyond the site boundaries. It's super important. And then lastly, as we've been talking about all morning, is how we can come together collectively and work together and be greater than the sum of our parts.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so, I mean, everyone knows that the nature agenda has been shooting up in both public and sort of private, government sectors, and we've seen paper after report after study telling us what we need to do and how to achieve that. And we've recently seen the Environment Act passed by the government, which will do make a huge difference to at least contribute in part to what we need to do and where we need to go. And in the words of Professor Lawton, what we need to do needs to be bigger, better, and what is the sort of the main point of this presentation is it needs to be more joined up. So local authorities will be sort of muddling through this as part of the Environment Act. That they'll be required to sort of generate these local nature recovery strategies, and there's different ways of doing that. There's different models which can be used to sort of identify where action needs to be taken at a local scale and a national scale. And just to give you a few of those examples, there's a model called Condartis which looks at quite a big scale, and it looks at sort of species flow across a landscape. So it looks at sort of species going north, south and east and west. And quite a few people use that to sort of look very, very high level at where our most important corridors through our landscape are. Another method which is quite often used is looking at sort of grid squares. So you take a given grid square, you look at how much woodland's currently there, how much grassland's currently there, and if it's higher than a certain percentage, then you can say that that area is strategically significant. It's a bit clunky, but it works in some instances. And my favourite one is beetle. So it does stand for something, but I won't pronounce it because I'll probably forget one of the letters. But it's been sort of coined and promoted by the Forestry Commission, and it looks at a really sort of granular and high resolution, a really local level, but it can be sort of multiplied and scaled up to national level. And that sort of looks at species mobility, look at taking core sites, so our most important wildlife sites for different broad habitat types, and how far a species is likely to travel from that into the wider landscape. So we're here today at Green Gains Live in Essex. And you've heard lots about what ground control are already doing. So there's Wildfell, there's Little Cowbridge Wood here, and what better a place than to sort of emphasise and sort of give you an example of how this model might work than Essex itself. And we're just going to set the scene of effectively what is possible. So Essex is absolutely peppered with internationally and nationally important sites. There's just under 2,000 designated wildlife sites in Essex, and natural green infrastructure covers about 14%. And these sort of fragmented remnants of habitat we're going to refer to as core habitat in this presentation. And these are the sites that we effectively need to expand and build on to allow them to sort of overspill into the wider landscape. A common thread running through a lot of the literature and studies that have happened in the last couple of decades is that everything needs to be more connected. That's what we need to actually do. And that will enable species mobility between sites. It increases genetic gene pools, which in turn effectively increases the resilience of the landscape.
So this is where the exciting bit comes in, and this is actually where the real journey begins for people here here today. This is all of our sites that we have an influence through customers and clients. 1,500 sites here in Essex, which is phenomenal. And you can see the distribution spread. That's spread across 70 clients, across all sectors that we work in. It's just phenomenal. And of course, the variability of the opportunities do vary based on the size of the site or the location of the site. But ultimately, there's a huge footprint to start to build this community and how we can come together for a greater good. But let's go further on to that, and we start adding on the road networks. And this is the road networks and the infrastructure at highways level. This isn't looking down at local level. We add on the rail networks on top of that, and you can see how they're starting to permeate and navigate and really transcend through the landscape and connect these habitats. We add on the waterways as well, absolutely. And then lastly, we've got utility, power. And you can really, it builds a picture. And I think, look, this image is the image that really brings it to life. And you can see the scale of the opportunity if we absolutely come together and collaborate and work together to connect habitats. Interestingly, and this is interesting, I'll go back to the core habitats here that Jack mentioned earlier. Over 80% of these sites sit within 400 meters of core habitats. Let's make those connections, enlarge those connections and make it more joined up. It's just the opportunity is there. But let's look, obviously, nature recovery ambitions. Look, we know the strategic ambitions that have come through from the environmental bill and stuff. But actually, those strategic ambitions, they initiate projects, ideas. And we've been involved. And just to outline and build on some of the conversations that Chris and Kim have highlighted here, look, we've been working on the Essex Forest Initiative, which is to plant 1 million trees. Similar to us, we want to plant 1 million trees. We're coming together as partners. The Big Green Internet is a really interesting initiative where it's looking to take fragmented woodlands from Epping to the North Sea in the east, from west to east, and join them up through wildlife corridors and hedgerows. They're initiatives spurned by people, opportunity, businesses, organisations. And there's many more, but I think it's about us coming together and seeing what's possible. And then I'm going to add on here, and we've talked about Wildfell and Little Cowbridge earlier today, but actually putting them on this map just demonstrates where they sit within the vicinity here. But actually, and I talked about an east-west link there, the ambitions that we have as well, as one of our own ambitions, is potentially to get a north-south link connection that actually helps to connect up these sites and all the other sites here in Essex. This really brings it to life, the opportunity, just in Essex. Over 3,000 linear metres of infrastructure, 1,500 sites. It's phenomenal, the opportunity.
So we've taken a sample area of sort of what we've considered typical Essex countryside now. And this is effectively just to drill down into a local context of, essentially what this sort of modelling technique might look like, and really bring it to life so people can actually see physically what we're talking about. And basically we'll just sort of illustrate a modelling approach which sort of identifies at a really high resolution actually what and where habitat interventions and action would be most valuable. So generally speaking, species mobility models, they sort of look at core woodland habitats and sort of how species that live within those core woodland habitats might diffuse into the wider landscape. And it's a great way to model what is common across the British landscape, where you've got fragmented habitats, and it's a great way to tell if actually are those habitats functionally linked to each other, are they connected enough, is the land that lies between them permeable enough for species to go through them. In this example, we've effectively used woodland sites, but generally these species models, they group them into broad habitat types. So woodland we've used here, but it's the same principles for grassland, wetland, and so on. And these core habitat types are sort of identified programmatically. So we take multiple data sets, which are sometimes freely available, sometimes not, to identify where the most important habitats are in the landscape. And then that's what we call the core habitats, and that's what we build the map from. So we've taken these from for example, designated sites, nature reserves, ancient woodland inventory, and priority habitat inventory in this case. So I'd like to give some kudos to Natural England, because they've made an amazing data set freely available very recently in April this year, and it's called Living England. And effectively, it identifies the white spaces in between all the habitat sites. So it's all the stuff that, I guess, traditionally conservationists and ecologists don't really care about. It's, you know, the core areas where the species are that everyone's, you know, getting on their hands and knees for. But this data set, which effectively identifies what's in the white space, allows us to do these models to see actually, you know, you've got core habitats with, you know, lots of species and important habitats in certain locations. What's around them? Are they able to cross landscapes because of what the farmland is surrounding? And in this map, we've used that data set to effectively add resistance factors to those habitats. And as you'll see, the red areas on the image, they illustrate areas with really high resistance to woodland species. So there'll be areas of really dense urban area and arable land, for example, cereal crops. And then the green areas are, you know, potentially non-core woodland sites, scrubland, species-rich grassland, which might be easier for a woodland species to travel across. And in this example, we've used a nuthatch, which is a bird native to Britain, which is widespread across England and Wales, as a sort of flagship species to just illustrate this model. And a nuthatch is effectively, there's a lot of research been done on its dispersal methods from sort of breeding sites. So it's known to travel or disperse up to 800 meters from its breeding site. So we've used those figures to effectively model how that might look, you know, for a nuthatch. How connected are these fragmented habitats of woodland? So this is the beetle analysis, which is what I spoke to you about earlier, which is my sort of preferred method, which effectively buffers those core habitats. And as you can see on the map, the sort of red areas are isolated core habitats where theoretically a nuthatch living in one of those core habitats can't sort of disperse further than that isolated habitat. So they're the isolated pockets. And then we've got the yellow, the blue and the purple clusters of functionally linked core habitat. So they're close enough and the land in between is permeable enough that theoretically species can travel between them. So the blue, so the buffer zones, you've got the dark buffer zones and you've got the light buffer zones. The dark ones is sort of the core functional land for the core habitats where species are readily able to move between. And then the light areas are sort of the maximum extent of where those species can get to. And that what we've called that the opportunity zone. So that's where implementing something there would sort of have maximum result to expand that network. And this gives us a blueprint to shape the conversation and meaningfully identify opportunities to expand networks.
So I'll go back to the exciting bit again. If we overlay, which should be coming up, our client sites and our infrastructure routes that's taken from that Essex map. This is really interesting. We can dig into the detail now and really actually understand where are those opportunities lie. And actually, for those, I'm going to come close to this screen for those who can see this screen. And actually, I want to pick up three observations really. This pink dot in the middle here, just above the railway line in the blue area here, you can see here there's an opportunity potentially with this site that actually it sits between two fragmented core habitats. So there's opportunities there to connect those habitats if there's the potential for land and space to actually put woodland planting in. So that's one example, which is fantastic. Now the other one is not the red herring, but you've got this linear infrastructure here running straight through this pilot area. And you can see how this linear infrastructure could help connect core habitats, but also, as Jack was talking about, it can help connect in these mobility zones, those areas that don't just connect just yet. So you can see how it comes together as a web. And lastly, and I'm going to draw your attention, for those who can't see the screen, to the periphery of the blue area on the left. You've got 3 dots kicking out on the side there. There's opportunities so potentially there's opportunities to actually enhance that reach of that mobility zone by doing works on there. So you're taking it further out into the environment. Of course, if we actually look back, and there's more core habitats around the areas we've not shown, and they would naturally probably link in. But you can start to see how we are being informed by the modelling about the opportunities that can happen on site and how you can then have the greater impact beyond. And Jack's going to carry on to an even more interesting bit.
So, not to belittle what Matt was saying about the opportunities to sort of expand networks and go beyond the reach of the existing habitats, but there are some real sweet spots in this example. So you can see the different sort of functionally linked clusters of core habitats, and where they overlap, that means that the gap is too great for a species, given the existing land use up there and the permeability of that, to go from one core habitat to the next. But if you were to implement a core habitat creation scheme in that exact location, then you would bridge the gap between those functionally linked habitats. So these are the real sweet spots as to where would be best placed. And unfortunately, we have a point in one of those sweet spots, and that's where we are today. So this is Little Cowbridge Wood, which, as you've heard a little bit about already, and you will all see later, where effectively, upon maturity, will be a core woodland priority habitat. And this has effectively acted as a stepping stone between two functionally linked separate core habitat clusters. So when this is implemented in the model, you can see that the green area reaches the purple zone and it also reaches the blue zone. So those are now, once that's implemented, actually functionally connected. So, I mean, this is just a proof of concept, effectively. Do the next slide. And it's a snapshot example of how one client site can be more than the sum of its parts. Looking beyond its own ownership boundary, tying into the wider landscape and to other client sites as well, to have more of a meaningful difference than just, here's our site, we can do this. It's looking beyond that.
So back to me. Imagine the possible. And this is the key here, is, look, we've shared with you, there's a very quick snapshot today of the opportunity at a local level. With the client sites, the infrastructure reach, there's real opportunity to collaborate here. We've also then gone on to show actually how theoretical modelling can help drive decision making on your sites that can actually have a bigger impact and a more connected impact at scale. But then, look, it's been mentioned this morning, Kim mentioned it a minute ago. Let's look at what that really looks like if we scale that up. And that's just a picture of overlapping dots, 55,000 sites. And we are talking about Essex, which sits in the very corner of that site. And if we scale up the opportunities we said on that pilot onto the national scale, it's quite phenomenal. And look, we are nature. We are part of this journey. We have the opportunity in this tent and online and those beyond to really make a difference, come together, take the lead. Let's carry on this conversation today and move it forward. And that's the end.
Matt has beautifully captured my closing remarks. I needed to say, no, it's excellent. I needed to say we have upcycled Matt. Matt started right out of university with us as a landscape architect. He moved on to run design and build. We put arboriculture under Matt, and then it was a whole bunch of other things, woodland creation, ecology, all this stuff. And I do think of it as upcycling because you start at one place, in the same way Chris and Philip and I, you start in one place, business development or health and safety, and then you can continue to grow in your careers to do much more of the stuff that matters to the business, that matters to you personally. Jack, I didn't give you the introduction you deserved. He's just joined us very recently as a biodiversity, or the biodiversity manager, and he was with Tony at Natural England. Not directly with Tony, but in Natural England. And he was the main author for the Biodiversity Metric 3.0, correct? Okay. And so we are so lucky to have him here helping us figure out, because we can learn as we go, which we do really well as an organization, but we need expertise coming in to really cross-pollinate what we already know inside. So well done, both of you. That was fascinating. I'm opening it up to questions, including our virtual guests that are joining today. Jill, do you have microphones that you could pass around? So anyone with a question, raise your hand.
Hello, thank you. Archie Ruggles, Bryce Plainswell Estate. I feel a little bit slightly out of sector here, but it's very nice to be invited to sit amongst people who own and manage far more land than I do. I suppose I'm here possibly nominally representing the 17.3 million hectares of agricultural land in the country, in the UK, 71% of the land, of which the average holding size is 81 hectares. Now, looking at the opportunities that have been mapped out there, variously described as white space or highly impermeable habitats and things like that, there does seem to me a huge opportunity for the people in this room and the people in my sector, perhaps through organisations like the Farmer Cluster that we're pulling together, I guess my question really is, how do we then bring that together? Because there's a huge amount that needs to be done for my sector to learn from all the people in this room as to how do you make those business decisions and the return on investment that you so clearly outlined for your sector. It's a much harder argument to make in the private small landowner sector and the farming sector. So I guess I throw it open to the expertise in the room as to how do we solve that problem? How do we take the learning and the expertise that you guys have got and deliver this across 17.3 million hectares?
Well, I'm going to pass this to Tony. What I will say, yeah, Archie just sent me a video from his beaver pond. Or, I don't know what the he's just introduced beavers to Essex, the first landowner to successfully do that. Yeah. Incredibly exciting. He's right up the street. We should have had him in our mapping exercise. But over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Kim. I'll just say that was amazing, Matt and Jack. That's an incredible piece of work you've done there. And I'm going to be asking if Natural England can actually, since you've got one of our chaps, I think I'll have to ask to have some of that intellectual property brought back in again, because, no, that was incredible and is exactly the kind of thing that relates to Archie's question and the extent to which we go beyond that being, your clients, and it's fantastic that you've done that, but to make it something which is the entire landscape, including the people who are not ground control clients. But the fact that you've done that is an amazing start, because then it's a way into the community that Archie is in, which is the farming landowning community, producing food, trying to do nature recovery. And if you can blend that group in to what you're doing, then it just goes to another level again. And so this is the opportunity we've got over the coming couple of years, because in that Environment Act that you put up there earlier on is a new government requirement for every county in England to produce a local nature recovery strategy. So that's the law, it's coming. It's just presently going through secondary kind of refinement of rules and regulations. But that will be the template that we will be able to use in Essex, in Suffolk, in Cambridgeshire, in Northamptonshire. Every county in England is going to have to do one. And there will be two things that will make these things work. So one is information and data, and the extent to which we can paint that picture. And what you just showed us is incredible. That's exactly what we need in order to be able to say, actually, don't put the woodland there, put it here. Don't restore the grassland there, do it here. We need a string of ponds here. We need to rewild that river valley, and these are the places to put beavers back. All of that can come from that kind of spatial analysis. So that's one piece we need. And actually, there's another government programme underway now, and Natural England very much leading that. It's called the National Ecosystem and Natural Capital Assessment, or words to that effect, isn't it? We got a big science team working on that. And so that's going to be refining the kind of data that you've already been using. We're going to go deeper and refining that further. So that information and data piece is critical. But then the next piece is going to be the quality of the interaction between all the different actors who can make a difference. And so the farmers, the companies who've got land next to a retail park, the infrastructure providers, rail, road, water, bringing all of them into a meaningful conversation where they can actually see what they can do based on that data. And so that's where Natural England will be supporting local authorities to try and make that happen. And we've got 40 new colleagues, haven't we, coming on stream soon. And Jack and Matt, I'm just thinking maybe, if you could show that presentation to those people who are just about to join us, that would be a fantastic way of giving them some energy and see what's possible, because that was really brilliant. So that's the answer, I think, Archie, is those local nature recovery strategies and then engaging people in that. And so in your community, county level NFU, CLA, you know, that's a way of galvanising those members, one would expect. And, you know, the farmer clusters that are popping up in different places, another way in. And local, the local nature partnerships, Simon is here, Simon Lister from the Essex Nature Partnership. You know, that there are institutions at county level. It's a happy coincidence that the wildlife trusts are organised at county level as well. So there's various kind of layers of you know, partnership building that could occur once we can see that picture laid out so clearly like that.
That's great.
Yeah.
I haven't got a microphone. Shall I just shout?
We're going to bring you a microphone. Fantastic.
Hi there. I'm Deb Davies-Tutt. I work and own Ashwell's Reclaimed Timber, which in essence we reuse the rainforest material that's already in this country to try and reduce any more coming in. We also own a site, so I suppose I'm bringing the conversation to a more layman type question. Our site backs onto some fenlands, so what practically could we do to try and introduce all the wonderful things you've been talking about today?
Whereabouts are you?
We literally up the road in Grays on the 128.
Yeah, so in terms of fine-grained knowledge of the local area, we have our local area team leader here, John Torles. John, I don't know if you know anything about that part of the county and can give any reflections on what might be the thing to do there. So basically this is about how you might interact with people who own land next to you, is it? Yeah. And what is it, a fen?
Yeah, it's fenland. We have an industrial estate, but we actually back onto some beautiful fenland, and it'd be lovely
Yeah.
if we could try and
Try and find some way of creating...
interact with it in a positive way.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So, John, I don't know if you've got anything you might say on that, but probably finding out who owns it and talking to them might be a good start. John, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, that's always a good start, is to kind of work out who kind of, you know, your neighbouring sort of landowners and their kind of level of interest in doing something here. I mean, it's a good start, you know, talking to, you know, sort of some of your wildlife trust representatives, because they've often got really good local knowledge about specifically, you know, what might be going on in that part of the world. And in due course, you know, as we're describing, with a local nature recovery strategy, that will start to paint a picture of the sort of nature that we're trying to put back in various spatial priorities across the county. So that will give you some really good clues as to the sorts of habitats and features we might want to see or might feel would be really good opportunities to put back into sort of local landscapes. But, you know, for very kind of, you know, local knowledge like that, you know, it's often, you know, sort of Natural England representatives, Wildlife Trust representatives, you know, or some of the local naturalists. There's always a lot of ideas and thinking out there about what might work, and looking at other good examples. In fact, I'm happy to chat with you afterwards about that particular area, and actually if we know of any other, you know, similar instances where folk are trying to sort of put nature back. So always, you know, really keen if people have got enthusiasm to see some change, you know, let's pick up that conversation.
Yeah, good. So I think the answer there is tap into the local networks, isn't it, and see what you can unearth. Because it may be there's people already thinking about that. Very likely there is, actually. That's my experience. 9 times out of 10, you know, get into a discussion about a particular space and there's already somebody thinking about it. Yeah.
In terms of process, I saw Ben from Cambridge University first, and then Simon. I've been looking for you all morning. Simon after that. Go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, for either of you or the panel, I was struck, you know, it's great looking at what organisations are doing to scale protection of nature, because they themselves are part of ecosystems that are changing fast. We look at sort of investors, you know, we've got the Task Force on Nature-Related Disclosure, we've got the EU taxonomy all opening up and starting to align, hopefully, the financial services. We've got supply chains, of course, regulation. So my question is really for the panelists. Do you see any particular external enablers that can really help, whether that's changing regulation or, you know, shifting supply chains and so on, that would also really help, you know, scale this protection of nature?
Panelist Tony, panelist maybe Ricky from Severn Trent. Could you want to give a little hint on direction of who you'd like to hear from specifically?
Yeah, I guess
Maybe the Thames.
The Thames crossing?
Crossing, perhaps.
All right,
is
Matt.
An interesting place. Sorry to put you on the spot. Or Thames Water, but either, I think, yeah, seem very relevant.
That's a tough question. Am I on the microphone?
It's like a cold call.
That's quite a tough question. I suppose what we're trying to do on Low Thames Crossing is trying to create overused word, an ecosystem around our supply chain to ensure that it comes back to a values-driven piece really. So I do think we get held back. Certainly, if I was talking government, we get held back by procurement legislation, which drives us to essentially we dumb it down to the lowest cost, and we don't put value in. So if I was to, in direct answer to your question, I think if we could better recognise in government procurement, it would unlock quite a lot. And that's a broader value question. I mean, it could pick up all sorts, not just nature, but I think the unlocking of that sort of procurement bit. And I know Cabinet Office are working on it, but we haven't seen it yet.
No. Tony Blair launched that strategy for sustainability and government procurement in April 2005. I was there. What are we now? So that's 17 years and they're working on it. Not bad. Serious point though. I mean, that is critical to unlock that power of procurement in specifying things that are going to help us on this journey. The other thing which I think is quite key at the moment is getting some standards agreed about what good looks like for private sector investment. So there's markets now coming for carbon. I mean, there's a bit there on woodland code and peatland codes, but it's wider than that. There is biodiversity net gain, and thank you for the work you did on the metric. So, we got some sense of what good looks like there in terms of creating a market for biodiversity credits. And there's a piece coming on nutrients. And so, if you've got a corporate ambition on carbon or nature, being able to have some certainty around, if I invest in this, it's going to be seen as good, compared to being criticised later on for investing in something that was a bit substandard. So creating those standards to pull the finance in, I think, is going to be quite important. And then having some accreditation of those standards, in the sense of actually, some official kind of recognition that this project or this initiative does meet the standard, therefore, the money will come. I think that would unlock quite a lot. And there is a live conversation about all of that. And I mustn't be too unkind about the slow cogs of government grinding on, otherwise I won't have a job.
We have an online question, but Simon Lister, Dr. Simon Lister, wildlife lawyer, and has been on the board with Tony at Natural England and also Northumbrian Water, which owns Essex and Suffolk Water as well, right? So he is leading the good life here in Essex, fighting for nature and the nature partnerships. And I only just met him a few weeks ago, which was extraordinary. Go ahead.
It'll come on, will it? Oh, well done. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Kim. Actually, two things. One is I wanted to really thank you and congratulate you on this incredibly stimulating last couple of hours. And I think the work Ground Control has been terrific, especially in the way you've engaged your customers, suppliers, and established this whole sort of move towards business playing such a positive role for nature. And likewise, I love those maps. And I'm speaking now as chair of the Local Nature Partnership, which was only set up here in Essex about 4 months ago, thanks to Essex County Council, who support us. And I also want to swipe those maps, because one of the jobs we've got to do is to come up with the local nature recovery strategy for the responsible authority, which is Essex County Council. And so that will be incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
And I just also wanted to make a plug for the Local Nature Partnership. As I said, we've only been going 4 months. We're one of the newest local nature partnerships in the country. But what we want to do is continue the conversation that has started in this tent, because it is a partnership. And so it is a mix of business, of farmers, of statutory agencies, of the NGOs, all those, and communities. I mean, there's some terrific community work going on in Essex, but we need more of it. But do please engage with us. And Sam Kennedy, I can see is the director of Environment Essex County Council. Please use her as a source of support. Ground Control is coming on the board, which is also fantastic. Archie is being modest because actually he is doing an incredible job up in North West Essex and has been instrumental in setting up this farmer cluster, which is starting to go there. We need more farmer clusters. We need more farmer champions. And please, anybody who can help us bring together powerful players in Essex who can make a difference, please contact us in the local nature partnership because we'd love to work with you. And thanks again, Kim. It's been an amazing morning.
Thank you, Simon. And actually, so we're here in Essex, but most of our customers are regional and national. And so maybe for anyone in this room, if you are in other parts of the country and you want to figure out how to connect with your local nature cluster group, then bring that on. But there are, the wildlife trusts are at our county level. There's so much information. It's trying to figure out how to connect with it. I have an online question from Ruskin's Tree Consultancy, Robert Wilkins. How important is soil regeneration and carbon sequestration? And is the UK doing enough?
How important is it?
How important? Yeah.
Yeah, so it's hugely important. So we often focus on the above ground carbon when it comes to ecosystems. If you look at some of the data that has been produced by some of the technical studies, you see that the biggest carbon per hectare is generally in wetlands, so peatlands in particular, and salt marsh is absolutely huge, and mangrove swamps, so coastal woodlands, you get accumulation of carbon in those at 5 times the rate that you do in kind of woodlands on dry land. And so sometimes when you start looking at the wider picture, and in the mangroves, it's the sediments, it's not the trees, it's the catching of the organic material. Same with the salt marsh, it's kind of accumulating in the ground rather than in the vegetation. So this can be absolutely enormous and often is not on the figures that people publish. Well, often we look at woodland carbon and what we're measuring is the above ground carbon, when in fact the stuff below the ground sometimes is bigger. And of course it gets disturbed by forestry activities, which then renders some of the calculations around, the impact of deforestation on climate. You may be sometimes getting only half the picture or even less. So it is huge. And this is one reason why the French government at the time of the Paris meeting in 2015, they launched an initiative called 4 parts per thousand, which is basically a calculation that some French scientists have made about the extent to which accumulating 4 parts per thousand more carbon in the soil per year would actually take a big chunk of the effort out of the net zero. I can't remember the actual numbers, it was a huge amount. And then, you translate that into, okay, so how do you get that increase in carbon at that modest level in the ground? Regenerative agriculture, stop disturbing peatlands, increase the area of grassland, the kind of things that people are increasingly talking about. But soil carbon, it's massive. The headline figure is that there's about twice as much carbon in the soil as there is in all the forests and the atmosphere combined. And the best thing to do is keep it there and increase it, which we don't do through how we treat the land.
So that's the impact of intensive agricultural practice is devastating for soil.
It's driving the organic matter out. So what we've been doing, we've basically been farming in a way which has depleted the natural fertility. And what we're now trying to do is to compensate for that through the use of fertilisers, some of which are coming in the form of ammonium nitrate, which in turn is made out of natural gas, which in turn is now kind of in this period of high price volatility, which then is an issue for food security. So, all these things, they kind of circle back on each other. And one of the greatest hedges we've got for the future is focusing on improving soil health for reasons of carbon, but also soil fertility, and also an element of climate change adaptation. Because if you increase the soil organic matter, it holds much more water. So in times of drought, your crops remain more resilient if the organic matter is high. And then in the winter, when you get a massive downpour, that helps take the edge off of floods, slows the flow by holding more water in the ground. So soil, it's kind of got multiple connections into all of this, and often neglected. I mean, it's kind of, something that people often don't think about.
So I don't know if you went to Chelsea Flower Show this year, But there was one of the big gardens was don't treat your soil like dirt.
Yeah, right.
And
very
the
like
other big show garden was on biodiversity, and they had beavers,
Mm.
or what should have been, if you know, in the natural environment, beavers there, and it was a huge, for the first time, that Chelsea is focusing on different things. Inside the main marquee, there was, I mean, the size of the stage, 2 gardens of a city, one where you've put in paving that allows water to go down into the earth, and all these pollinating plants and drought-resistant plants, and the other, it's just all tarmac. And it showed all the flooding on that property,
Yeah.
and it was sponsored by the London Fire Brigade.
Oh, right.
That's what they deal with, all the flooding because of the way we treat the earth.
Okay.
I don't know how much time we have left. One more question.
This will be the killer one.
Standing up, standing up.
Sorry, this gentleman was in front of me as well, and he was thinking that it was going to be his question. And I nicked it. I'm so sorry. My name's Andy Martyreich. I work for Western Power Distribution. For anybody that doesn't know, we're the electricity operator across South Wales, South West, East and West Midlands, about to become National Grid Electricity Distribution because we've become part of National Grid. Probably the biggest anticlimax, actually, of this question is it's not really a question. It's a plea. And thank you, Kim, and everybody from Ground Control for organising this. I think the most important thing I'm taking away from today, and the important messages that we've got, is how important it's going to be to share best practice on this. As industry and business, we've spent all of our time coming up with cracking ideas and keeping them to ourselves, because that's what business is about. But the nature emergency requires us to share best practice. For example, in Western Power, we have 220,000 kilometres of overhead lines and cables. All of the overhead lines are scanned with LiDAR, with helicopters taking still images, 73,000 data points every second from LiDAR. And at the moment, we keep that to ourselves. I'm sure there's a huge amount of work, especially on the mapping stuff that we just talked about, the huge amount that could be done with some of that data. And we're just starting to consider what we could do with that data. We're just starting to consider how a substation could look if it embraced nature rather than pushed it away. Interesting to hear Ricky talk about the work that Severn Trent are doing. We should already be working together. It shouldn't take an event in a tent for us to meet each other. We need to formalise this stuff. So I guess a question for Tony really is, how do we formalise? How do we ensure that best practice for the benefit of the environment is shared and doesn't rely on us meeting each other over a coffee in a tent?
No, that's a really great question. And I'm just thinking as you were talking about the opportunities we've got that are coming out of events like this, where people are thinking, okay, I now get it, and what can I do? And actually, you know, quite a lot of what you can do is already being done by someone else. And so being able to pull up those examples and show them so that people can get some inspiration, they can learn from things that have been mistakes, and if you did it like this, you'd get there quicker, you know, that kind of thing. Aidan here is helping to lead the Natural England National Nature Recovery Network partnership and thinking about some of this stuff. We had a great meeting yesterday in Middlesbrough with quite a few of the different actors who are involved in this. And I think certainly one thing that came from there yesterday, and you're repeating it again now, is the need for somebody to come up with some kind of collection of examples of things that are happening, both for that reason of, you know, so we can all learn and be inspired, but also to start to underline the fact that this is not future theoretical activity. People are doing it now. And I think that creates confidence. And so, Aidan, I think we should take that away and have a little think about... Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it on? Can you hear
Yes.
me? As Tony said, we had our Nature Recovery Network Delivery Partnership meeting for the last 2 days in Middlesbrough, looking at nature, regeneration, social deprivation, economic redevelopment, that kind of thing. The thing we know from the partnership, which now has over 650 organisations, is we do need a place, as you said, to share emerging best practice, snapshots of what people are doing, solutions they're coming up with. We're working through the process at the moment, Tony, of getting what we're calling an online digital presence.
Okay, there we are.
We don't call it a website.
Yeah.
And we're going through the internal governmental process of getting
We don't want
that
to alert
so that
government
we can
comms.
populate it with examples like that. Everybody in the partnership obviously can access that, and it's going to be widely available to everybody. But we want to do that as a provision back to, here's a good example of something that was cracked here in Wales, you could do it in Essex and vice versa. So yeah, we are on it. Brilliant.
Good, excellent. Thanks, Aidan.
I love that. Sounds like a children's book, an event in a tent.
Yeah.
right? So how do you get a conversation started? And that was such a powerful question. There are so many points of connectivity here. It is, it's my duty, first of all, to thank Jill, Sam, Chloe, Amanda, everyone in our team that put this event together. And it is, you know, if I say everybody in ground control, I'm not supposed to speak where it's exaggerated, but yes, everybody in ground control is so behind this, or they wouldn't have joined our business, or they wouldn't have stayed. So thanks to everyone in the company that has made this happen today. Thank you so much to our, you know, world-class guests that have come to share their knowledge and experience, and for all of you for joining us. What I hope you take away, an event and a tent. I'm going to ask Jill to set up something on LinkedIn that's a community group and send out a link for all you to follow, because you can probably get it already on Evergreen Fund or Ground Control, but let's figure out something, because we can't share your data around and link you up, but where you could come together and post things and talk about things and connect through that following. Is that possible? Event and a tent, I like that. Children's book next. We're gonna wrap up with just some things. If you have taken things away on how you can use your property in a positive way for nature to connect networks for nature conservation, if you've taken away what you can do to help cross-pollinate and share this information, share more loudly what you're doing, turn the volume up, just please do it. If you heard somebody say something and you want to learn more, reach out. Just get the conversation going and keep it going. And I just think, you know, change for the future, for our own well-being. If you don't care about it, for your own well-being, there is such a direct and vitally important link. So thank you for coming. Now we're going to have lunch. There's tours of the woods. It depends how fast you walk and who your tour guide is, but fabulous ecologists are leading through there, and you'll pick up the beehives and some solar and wind energy, all sorts of fun stuff. So please gather for that. Jill, is lunch first or after that? Or during? Very loose now. Thank you so much for your attention, and thank you. Warm applause for everybody. Thanks.
It's time to rewild for nature recovery. We're in the midst of a biodiversity crisis and a climate emergency, but it's not all bad news. We're in a very privileged position as landowners and land managers to make a difference and use our sites for nature recovery. At Ground Control, we're working with our clients across the UK. These include Tesco's, Sainsbury's, the NHS, Travelodge and Severn Trent Water to take a nature-positive approach to land management. By working together, we're looking to boost biodiversity and achieve environmental goals. So what can you do for nature? Today we're down at Little Cowbridge Wood, which is part of our 35-acre Green Gains site in Essex. We've planted over 22,000 trees as part of the woodland creation, and we changed the management of the existing hedgerows and grasslands to focus on nature recovery. On this tour, we'll share a breadth of rewilding techniques that include woodland, meadow and habitat creation. You'll take away the know-how to enhance your land for nature. Together, we'll turn biodiversity ambition into action. So we're down in Little Cowbridge Wood. It's our woodland creation project, the first large-scale nature recovery project that we did as a business. We've basically created 9.2 hectares of new native broadleaf woodland from 2 underused areas of grasslands. We've worked in conjunction with the Forestry Commission to gain grant funding for the capital works and a number of other stakeholders such as the Environment Agency to develop our plans to make the most of this woodlands within this specific situation. We've used a variety of native trees and shrubs. We've got 16 different tree species that include oak, hornbeam, willow, alder, so a really good range. It's really important to get as much variety in the tree species as we can because of the challenges of climate change, potential future pests and diseases coming in. And alongside those trees, we've got 10 native species of hedgerow and woodland edge shrubs. We developed this site because it was the land that we had available, but it can be scalable both up and down in terms of scope. We can create woodlands can be the size of a tennis court to really extensive woodland where the land allows. These nature recovery techniques can be applied to a whole range of sites, and we can tailor-make those to the land that is available. In terms of nature recovery, we see this new woodland playing a really important role in this location, and we're looking at how that connects through with the hedgerow network. We're developing the hedgerows around the site, and they will be the links to the other areas of woodland in the area. The site here, we're looking at the boundary, which has had an existing agricultural hedgerow to it. It's got a footpath as well, so we've got public access. And what we've done is really look at how we can maximise this feature for nature. So we've let the hedgerow grow out, we're not cutting it back as frequently. We need to maintain the access for the footpath, but we can let the feature expand naturally, and we've got natural regeneration, we've got an increase in height. So this is something that you could look to do on your own site. Assess your sites to see where operationally you could let hedgerows grow a bit taller, a bit wider. You could look to introduce tree planting into those hedgerows, and this will create more of a nature corridor that will attract a much wider range of insects, birds and other mammals, so really multiple benefits by just changing your management regime on site. Utilising your hedgerows can happen on a wide range of scales. You don't need miles and miles of hedgerow to make an impact. Hedgerow is a really useful connector, so one side of your site to the other and connecting out into the wider landscape. This is the second area of woodland creation. It's a wet woodland, and we've designed the tree species around that. So we've got more willow, alder, downy birch, which gives a totally different character to this area of the site. And most importantly, we've got a significant area of open space, which is really important to give that diversity of habitats within a given area. So this has allowed us to manage the grassland in a totally different way. It's gone from being grazed by sheep to a very low level to being pretty much left to develop over the seasons. In turn, by changing the management of the grassland, we'll be attracting a wider range of insects, which will then attract a wider range of birds and other animals that feed on those. Also, it allows an open area for bats to forage and potentially for predators like barn owls to hunt on the small mammals that will be attracted to this type of habitat. If you've got grassland on your own site, the first step would be to look at changing the management regime. So where you've got amenity grass, you might be cutting it 6 to 12 times a year under a standard maintenance arrangement. So reducing that right down to potentially cut and collect only once a year at the end of August will be the first step to transforming that grassland for nature. The second opportunity would be to increase the species diversity by wildflower plug planting, or potentially overseeding areas with wildflower seed, and that just increases the diversity of plants that you've got with that area, and that will bring those benefits to biodiversity along with them. We're very lucky at Little Cowbridge to have a watercourse running through the middle of the new woodland creation site, so that gives us a real opportunity to develop another type of habitat within the same area. But with that opportunity comes responsibility, so we need to make sure we're protecting that feature as well as enhance it. So if you've got a river or a watercourse on your site, the first thing we'd look to do is carry out that initial baseline evaluation. We'd come in with our ecologists to do a habitat survey, but also a species survey to see what you've got present on site at the moment. And then from that we can develop our designs to reflect and enhance those species and also bring in new species as well that aren't being currently catered for by the design. We want to build up tree planting but in smaller pockets, not shading out the watercourse too much, getting that balance between sunlight and shade on the water to make the most of that existing habitat. We're very lucky at Little Cowbridge to have some amazing specimen trees around the site, like this majestic oak that we're under now. And it's about assessing those, A, from a health and safety perspective, but also from a nature perspective to see what features are there that could attract nesting birds and bats. We've assessed this tree as a moderate potential for bats. It has existing natural features within it, but we could also enhance those potentially with bat boxes or bird boxes for the bird population. Scrub is a very important habitat because it's actually very scarce around the UK. Through management it has been lost, and it's really biodiverse and a rich habitat. Here we've tried to let that develop by letting blocks of hawthorn, blackthorn spread, allowed bramble to develop, so really encouraged that element of the landscape. It's viewed importantly by the DEFRA metric, so it scores very highly as a habitat type. If you've been inspired to rewild your land and take part in nature recovery for the UK, then start your biodiversity conversation with us. Head to ground-control.co.uk to discover more.